Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, the place where curiosity comes with a blanket, and science takes the slower path so you can ease into it. Tonight we're going to let our imagination stretch in a direction that nature itself never allowed. We're going to picture a world where the very first humans opened their eyes, lit their first fires, and took their first steps not in a landscape of lions and mammoths, but under the long shadows of dinosaurs. That means wondering how fragile, clever primates might have fared in a land of giants, a world where thunder came not from the sky but from footsteps on the ground. Before we settle into this thought experiment, I'd like to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it morning, evening, or maybe a sleepless middle of the night where you are? And can you imagine looking out your window right now and seeing not a passing car or a quiet street, but a neck taller than the trees bending down to browse on leaves? If that image intrigues you, or if you just enjoy exploring these strange crossroads of science and imagination as a gentle way to wind down, it would mean a lot if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach other people who might also be ready for a slow escape into what-if worlds. Now let's ease into the story, no rush, just a steady walk into it. Because tonight we're going to bring together two timelines that in reality never touched, and see what unfolds if humans and dinosaurs shared the same Earth. When you think about the history of Earth, it's easy to imagine it as a single, long unfolding story, but really it's more like a library with shelves that rarely line up. Dinosaurs ruled their era tens of millions of years before the first humans even arrived. By the time our earliest ancestors walked upright, the last of the dinosaurs had been gone for longer than we've been alive as a species. But what if that wasn't the case? What if a shuffle in the grand calendar had placed us side by side? The idea feels almost like a child's drawing, with cavemen facing off against Tyrannosaurus Rex, but beneath the fantasy there's a chance to really think about survival, adaptation, and imagination. Because humans, even in their earliest form, were fragile, slow, and dependent on wits more than strength. Dinosaurs, on the other hand, came in every size from chicken-like runners to titanic plant-eaters heavier than whole neighbourhoods. Put them in the same scene and the contrasts are almost overwhelming. Imagine the first campfires. In our real history, those flames flickered at the edge of forests filled with big cats, scavenging hyenas, and mammoths that could crush a person with one step. But in this new world, that circle of firelight might sit beneath the looming shadow of a sauropod, one of those long-necked giants that stretched across the treetops. Instead of mammoths trumpeting in the distance, you might hear a low rumbling call that shakes the ground as a creature longer than a train slowly wanders past. The night would be different, more dangerous perhaps, but also stranger, filled with sounds our species never truly knew. Think of how humans would have described such sights to one another. The first stories whispered around those fires might have been about enormous beasts that drank whole rivers and birds with teeth that soared overhead. For the people themselves, life was already a challenge. Early humans were small in number, scattered, and vulnerable. They depended on sharp eyes and sharper stones, on close cooperation, and on moving when the land demanded it. Placing them among dinosaurs raises questions not just about danger, but about scale. How would you hunt if your prey was dwarfed by creatures that could crush a hunting party underfoot? Would humans have focused entirely on the smaller dinosaurs, ones the size of deer or antelope, instead of chasing mammoths or bison? Maybe. It's not hard to picture a band of hunters tracking a nimble dinosaur with feathers along a riverbank, spears raised, while just beyond them, a much larger predator prowled. That thought alone changes the rhythm of life, because every pursuit would carry the risk of becoming prey. Then there's the matter of tools. At the time our ancestors chipped their first axes from stone, they were dealing with animals that could be killed with teamwork and persistence. Persistence hunting, running an antelope until it collapsed from exhaustion, is a strategy that worked. But picture trying that against a dinosaur the size of a bus. There's no running it down. There's no tiring it out before it simply turns and crushes you. Humans would have had to refine weapons much earlier, developing strategies to survive among these creatures. Fire would have been more than warmth. It would have been a shield, a way to draw a line between fragile flesh and the raw power of jaws and claws. The landscapes themselves would have looked unfamiliar. Our ancestors really walked through African savannas with scattered trees, through cold steppes and dense forests. Dinosaurs thrived in climates warmer, more humid, filled with ferns and towering conifers. If humans had lived there, they would have grown up among plants that no longer exist today. Their shelters might have been beneath trees with trunks wide as houses, or caves that echoed with the calls of creatures we only know through fossils. The smells would have been stronger too. Vegetation trampled by enormous herds, carrion left by predators that could take down things larger than elephants, the musk of creatures that filled entire valleys with their presence. For an early human, every day would be a balance of awe and fear. But we can also think about curiosity. Humans are driven to watch, to wonder, to imitate. Imagine children pointing at a herd of duck-billed dinosaurs and trying to mimic their calls. Imagine someone carving the shape of a horned face into wood, long before the first cave paintings we know. The art, the language, the culture would all be influenced by these living mountains that wandered the earth beside them. Instead of lions and bears in myths, it would be dinosaurs. The first gods might not have been imagined from the sky, but from the earth-shaking power of creatures so vast they seemed eternal. Survival, though, would not have been romantic. Predators like velociraptors, utahraptors, or even Tyrannosaurus would have been daily threats. A small band of humans could fight off a lion with fire and shouting, but a coordinated pack of raptors might have been much harder. Humans might have had to change their habits, sleeping in trees more often, building shelters with spikes or walls to keep out attacks. Communities would have needed to be larger sooner, because only numbers could offset the sheer danger. The balance between predator and prey would have been more tilted, forcing humans to innovate or vanish. Consider water. Rivers and lakes were lifelines for humans, but they were also magnets for dinosaurs. Every trip to fetch water would mean sharing space with creatures that treated the shoreline as their dining table. Fish-eating dinosaurs, crocodiles even larger than the ones we know, would lurk there. Humans might have developed more cautious routines, building tools to draw water without approaching directly, or posting guards constantly. That simple daily act would become a test of nerves and cooperation. And yet, humans have always adapted. Perhaps they would have found allies among the smaller dinosaurs, not tame in the sense we think of with dogs, but opportunities to observe and exploit patterns. Just as wolves followed humans and slowly became dogs, maybe certain feathered dinosaurs could have lingered near camps, eating scraps, warning of larger predators with their cries. It's speculative, but not impossible. Such partnerships might have changed the course of both species. Instead of dogs at our side, perhaps small bird-like dinosaurs would have filled that role, shaping our path in unexpected ways. Thinking about scale again, imagine migration. In real history, humans spread slowly out of Africa, following herds and seasons. In this altered world, migration routes would have been dictated by dinosaur movements. Whole valleys might become impassable when filled with sauropod herds. Predators might stalk particular regions, forcing people to avoid them for generations. Over time, human groups would learn not just to track their prey, but to track the giants, weaving their lives around the rhythms of creatures that dwarfed them. This knowledge, passed through stories and experience, would form a kind of natural calendar. Instead of stars marking the seasons, it might be the arrival of a certain herd, the return of a particular predator. It's worth pausing to think about what this would do to human bodies. Constant danger from such enormous animals might have pushed evolution differently. Speed, agility, and coordination might have been selected for more strongly. Perhaps humans would have developed greater physical endurance earlier, stronger throws, faster reflexes, or maybe intelligence itself would have sharpened more quickly, because only cunning could outmatch raw size. Our brains might have grown under the pressure of surviving among dinosaurs, shaping us into a different species altogether. And yet, as dangerous as this world would be, it would also be rich. Food sources would be abundant, from dinosaur eggs the size of melons to the smaller creatures that lived alongside the giants. Plants themselves would offer variety unknown today. Early humans might have developed unique diets, unique medicines, by experimenting with what grew in those ancient soils. Curiosity would be as important as caution. Exploration, even in fear, would still have driven them forward. Picture a night again, the fire crackling, the stars dimmed by a canopy of strange trees. Beyond the firelight, a low rumble shakes the earth as something passes. It doesn't attack, it doesn't even notice. It just moves on, a living hill in the dark. Around the fire, people whisper about it, pass stories, imagine what it means. Those stories would carry on. They would form the roots of culture, of religion, of identity. Living with dinosaurs wouldn't just change survival, it would change how humans understood themselves. And of course, not every encounter would be survived. Many wouldn't. That harsh reality would shape traditions, warnings, and rituals. People might paint symbols not just for hunting success, but for protection against creatures that towered above them. They might leave offerings to steer herds away, or to beg predators not to come close. Whole belief systems might grow from trying to explain the presence of such overwhelming neighbours. In that world, every day would be framed by giants, not just physically, but in memory, in imagination, in fear, and in awe. Humans, so small and so new, would have found themselves in a theatre already full, sharing the stage with creatures that had ruled for millions of years, and that stage would not have bent easily to their arrival. When you think about history, it feels ordered because we learn it in steps, one after another, as if the planet laid everything out in a neat line. Dinosaurs came first, they vanished, mammals rose, and eventually people appeared. It looks clean in a textbook, but the truth of Earth's history is messier. Entire ages came and went, entire families of creatures lived out their full story and disappeared before others even began. Dinosaurs lived for over 150 million years, while humans in our current form have only been around for a tiny fraction of that. Putting the two together means tearing the timeline open, pulling threads from different shelves of Earth's library and weaving them into a single fabric that never existed. It's a world out of place, one that would never have been natural but still feels strangely possible when you let your imagination run. If we actually imagine that shuffle, the first thing that strikes you is how uneven it would be. Humans would have arrived late to a world already claimed. Dinosaurs didn't just live on Earth, they dominated every continent. From the poles to the equator, they were the main characters in every landscape. Humans, by contrast, were late arrivals with almost no place in that order. We would have been intruders, vulnerable and without the claws, teeth or scales that every other creature had evolved to deal with. That imbalance defines the whole thought experiment. Instead of stepping into a world waiting for us, we'd be forced into one that already had rulers. Think about the first steps onto a savanna or into a forest in that scenario. In our actual history, early humans could shape the environment slowly, with fire, with tools, with coordinated hunting. Over time, they changed landscapes to suit themselves. But in a dinosaur world, that sense of influence would vanish. No matter how clever humans became, the scale of dinosaurs would overwhelm it. A herd of sauropods could flatten a carefully built camp in a single afternoon. A single predator could undo months of hunting or gathering with one ambush. The balance of power would sit heavily against us, and survival would mean learning to adapt to rules we didn't set. That imbalance would also shape how humans viewed themselves. Instead of seeing their fires, their tools, and their shelters as signs of control, they would be constant reminders of fragility. A spear might help against a wolf or a lion, but against a creature towering 5 stories tall, it would feel almost meaningless. That sense of smallness might have changed the very way humans thought about life. Our real history is full of confidence, of people believing they could master nature, bend it, and eventually dominate it. But in a world where every horizon held giants, that confidence might never have taken root. People might have seen themselves as permanent survivors, never rulers, shaping a culture of humility rather than mastery. It's also worth picturing the environment itself. The Mesozoic world wasn't just populated by dinosaurs, it was structured for them. The plants, the climate, the cycles of life all tilted towards supporting creatures of immense size. Forests of cycads, ferns and conifers covered much of the land, providing food for animals with appetites that could strip whole valleys. If humans had walked into that, their daily experience would have been foreign compared to the grasslands and plains of our real past. They would have had to adjust to food sources unfamiliar, plants that modern humans never encountered. Some would be edible, others poisonous, and figuring that out would be a process paid for with mistakes. That slow, cautious testing of the environment would have been constant, made harder by the presence of predators that didn't allow much room for error, and predators are where the thought experiment becomes even more lopsided. Lions and leopards, dangerous as they are, can be driven off by noise, by fire, by persistence. But dinosaurs like raptors hunted in groups, using strategies that would have matched human cooperation in eerie ways. Facing them wouldn't just be about strength, it would be about intelligence, speed, and luck. Humans might have avoided open ground entirely, clinging to cliffs, forests, and swamps where the giants couldn't follow. They would have become creatures of the margins, slipping into the spaces left over, living in the cracks of a world not made for them. That image alone changes the story of humanity from one of expansion to one of constant retreat, always on the edge of something bigger. Still, humans have a habit of turning weakness into strength. Being out of place might have forced new developments much earlier. Cooperation would be more than helpful. It would be essential. A lone person could not stand against a dinosaur, but a group with coordination and planning might survive encounters by distracting, by setting traps, by driving predators toward hazards. That shift toward complex planning might have accelerated human intelligence. The need to constantly think ahead, to work together seamlessly, and to find ways to tip the scales against impossible odds could have shaped our brains in ways very different from the slow, gradual process we know. Out of place in the natural order, humans might have leapt forward mentally just to keep pace with survival. But being clever doesn't erase the scale of the threat. Imagine daily life. Going to collect fruit in the forest might mean encountering a herd of hadrosaurs, harmless but enormous, capable of trampling anything in their path. A quick trip to fetch water might place you in sight of a predator the size of a bus, forcing you to wait for hours hidden in reeds before it passes. Children would grow up not just fearing animals, but understanding that at any moment the ground could shake with the arrival of something far larger than anything they'd ever seen. That constant tension would mark their stories, their play, their rituals. A child's toy might not be a carved lion or antelope, but a horned dinosaur, already part of their imagination before they even understood the danger. It's easy to see this as overwhelming, but humans have always found ways to fit themselves into whatever world they faced. Being out of place might not mean being doomed. It might mean finding niches. Small dinosaurs would be prey, eggs would be food, and plants would provide fibers and medicines. The giants would dominate the open lands, but people would learn to weave through the gaps to exploit the edges. In that way, the mismatch of scale might not end the story of humanity, but twist it, shaping us into a species defined by surviving in a world where everything else was stronger, larger, and older. This also brings up the question of extinction. Dinosaurs didn't vanish in this alternate world, at least not on schedule. Humans might have been another force pushing against them. Small in number, yes, but persistent, intelligent, and resourceful. People might not have killed dinosaurs directly, but they could have changed the balance in subtle ways. Fire, for example, alters landscapes. In our history, burning grasslands encouraged growth that benefited the animals people hunted. In a dinosaur world, fire might fragment habitats, weaken food chains, and disrupt herds. Slowly, humans might have become another factor in a system already under stress, adding pressure to creatures that seemed invincible. Out of place as we were, we might still have tipped the scales. The image of this alternate Earth is unsettling because it highlights just how precarious survival is. Our real history feels natural to us because we're the end result. But imagining ourselves in a world we weren't meant to inhabit shows how fragile that path really was. One shuffle in timing, one overlap of eras, and the story of humans might have ended before it ever began. Being out of place isn't just uncomfortable, it can be final. Yet the exercise of imagining it reminds us that survival is not just about strength, but about adaptability, cooperation, and imagination. Humans might have found a way, even in a world where every horizon was filled with giants. The idea of being out of place also works on a deeper level. We sometimes forget how new we are, how brief our presence on Earth has been compared to the creatures that came before. Dinosaurs ruled for spans of time so long they make our entire history look like a flicker. To put humans beside them is to remember that we're not inevitable, not guaranteed. Our place in the world is fragile, contingent, and sometimes accidental. Imagining ourselves in a different order of time shows just how easily things could have been otherwise. That awareness, far from being discouraging, can make the present feel sharper, more significant. We're here not because it was inevitable, but because countless accidents of history lined up in our favour. As the thought flows forward, you can see how this altered world sets the stage for everything else. If humans began their story beside dinosaurs, every step afterward would be shaped by that mismatch. Our tools, our bodies, our cultures, even our sense of ourselves would grow out of being surrounded by giants. The story wouldn't be one of easy triumphs, but of constant adjustment. And that sense of always being out of place might have changed us into something both familiar and entirely different. When you picture the earliest people, it isn't skyscrapers or cities, or even villages that come to mind. It's bare feet pressing into soil, stone tools clutched in hands that are still learning what hands can do, and the first sparks of fire pushing back the dark. Those first footsteps were cautious, but they carried the weight of an entire future. In our history, they fell on landscapes filled with animals we can still recognise: antelope, elephants, lions, and hyenas. But in this reimagined world, every step forward lands in the shadows of creatures that never should have been there. Dinosaurs that had owned the earth long before humans even thought of fire. That simple act of walking into a clearing, looking up, and seeing something vast and scaled instead of familiar mammals would have changed everything about how the first humans understood their place. The first thing those early feet would have met was terrain shaped by giants. Trails wouldn't just be narrow paths through brush, but broad corridors pressed into the ground by herds of animals heavy enough to flatten trees. A human walking along one of those paths would feel like a child wandering down a road made for titans, each footprint a reminder that they were guests on someone else's land. That sense of scale would be constant. Even grass as we know it was rare in the age of dinosaurs. Instead, people would move through forests thick with ferns and cycads, plants taller than them, hiding both food and danger. Every step would be a decision. Do you press forward into the undergrowth? Do you follow the giant trail? Or do you circle back and hope for safety? Walking in those places would never be quiet. The air would be filled with the low rumble of sauropods moving through the distance, the shrieks of smaller dinosaurs darting through branches, and the occasional thunderous crash of something enormous shifting its weight. For humans, sound was always a clue, always a sign. A snapping branch might mean a predator in the grass. In this world, the sounds would be overwhelming, a constant reminder that they were not the only ones walking here. The first steps weren't just tentative because of uncertainty. They would be cautious because danger was everywhere, woven into the very background of life. Now imagine that same first step, not just in movement, but in discovery. Humans were explorers from the start. They looked at tracks in the dirt, at broken plants, at stones, and tried to understand what those things meant. The first time they came across the footprint of a dinosaur, the shock must have been overwhelming. A print larger than their entire body pressed into the mud, stretching in a line that disappeared into the trees. To us today, a fossilized track is an artifact, something we study in safety. To them, it would have been a warning sign, proof that something beyond imagination had passed by recently. Following it would be unthinkable, yet leaving it behind would feel like walking away from the story of the world itself. Every step humans took brought them closer to fire, to tools, to cooperation, but each of those developments would feel different when set beside dinosaurs. Fire would have been a step not just toward warmth and cooking, but toward survival against predators many times their size. The glow of flames at night would mark the boundary between safety and terror. For the first people, fire in our timeline meant comfort. In this altered one, it would mean the difference between being trampled in the dark and seeing dawn. Even the act of carrying a torch would feel different, because that light wasn't just a tool. It was the only defense against jaws and claws that no human could outrun. Stone tools, too, take on a new meaning here. The first chipped axes and blades were already revolutionary, giving humans the ability to cut, scrape, and build. But against dinosaurs, their role would be humbler. A blade might slice fruit or butcher smaller animals, but no one could imagine taking down a creature taller than trees with stone alone. Instead, those tools would serve as reminders of limitation, useful for daily life but powerless against the rulers of the land. In our history, tools gave people power. In this one, they would mark the smallness of that power. The first footsteps forward with a stone blade in hand would still be brave, but bravery would always be measured against the impossibility of true control. The steps of children would matter most. Children are the reason groups moved, explored, and built shelters. In a world with dinosaurs, their footsteps would be the most vulnerable. Every path chosen would have to protect them. Every decision about where to camp or when to travel would revolve around the smallest feet in the group. You can imagine the fear of parents seeing a child wander toward the edge of a clearing where a predator's shadow loomed. The first lessons those children learned might not have been about fire or hunting, but about silence, hiding, and caution. They would grow up knowing that every step outside safety was a step into a world that belonged to something else. Walking wasn't just a physical act for humans. It was symbolic. The way groups spread, the way they carried their lives from one place to another. In this alternate history, each migration would feel like trespassing. Crossing valleys, rivers, and mountains wouldn't be about exploring new ground. It would be about moving through territory claimed by creatures that didn't recognize them. Imagine the first footsteps into a new valley, where herds grazed, each creature larger than anything they'd ever seen. Humans would have to weigh every move, deciding whether to risk staying close for food or to skirt the edges, surviving on less but avoiding notice. Those decisions would shape the path of humanity, each one a delicate step between survival and extinction. But there's another side to those footsteps. Curiosity. People don't just walk to survive, they walk to see what lies beyond. Even in danger, that drive doesn't vanish. The first time a group of humans followed dinosaur tracks not out of fear but out of wonder would mark a turning point. They might find nests filled with enormous eggs, or carcasses picked over by smaller creatures. Those discoveries would become stories told and retold. The first steps weren't just about danger, they were about learning, about piecing together what kind of a world they lived in. Every footprint pressed into the earth was a question. What is this place, and what does it mean for us? Those questions would also shape identity. In a world shared with dinosaurs, people might see themselves not as rulers of the land, but as walkers, as wanderers who pass through spaces too large to claim. The act of walking itself could become sacred, a way of acknowledging their fragile role. Every step would be remembered, not because it conquered, but because it endured. People would measure their lives in steps taken, paths crossed, dangers avoided. That sense of constant movement, of never standing still too long, might become the rhythm of their existence. And of course, not every step would lead to safety. Some would end in tragedy, tracks cut off by predator prints, trails scattered with bones, echoes of lives ended too soon. Those losses would be lessons for others. Each misstep would become a warning. Each path avoided by one group would be passed down as knowledge to the next. Over time, the steps of the living would be guided by the steps of the dead, a cycle of memory written into the ground itself. It's tempting to think of the first footsteps as small, uncertain, and fragile, but they were also monumental. They carried the weight of survival, the hope of exploration, and the burden of living in a world not built for them. Each one pushed humanity forward, not into mastery but into coexistence with giants. The steps themselves would echo, not just through valleys and forests, but through culture, memory and imagination. Walking became more than moving. It became a way of living, a way of carving a space in a world that belonged to others. So the image stays simple, a figure moving across soft earth, firelight flickering in the distance, stone in hand, eyes wide, not just with fear, but with wonder. Every step forward is small, yet every step is everything. The world they walk through isn't theirs, but still they walk. That act, repeated over and over, becomes the foundation of a story that would look nothing like the one we know, yet would still belong to us in its own way. When people imagine a world filled with dinosaurs, the mind usually jumps to the largest ones first. The towering sauropods stretching their necks across the canopy, the horned giants locking heads in noisy confrontations, the predators with teeth long enough to pierce bone in one strike. This was truly the age of giants, an era where scale itself was different from what we know now. Even the smallest dinosaurs looked unusual compared to today's animals, but it was the largest that defined the landscape, shaping everything from the vegetation to the weather in subtle ways. For humans walking among them, that scale would be impossible to ignore. Every step into a valley or forest would reveal creatures so large they seemed almost unreal, and yet they would be as common as deer or elephants are to us. The sauropods are usually the first that come to mind. Animals like Brachiosaurus or Argentinosaurus were longer than a blue whale, taller than any tree in sight, and heavier than a fleet of trucks. Standing near one would mean craning your neck upward until you felt dizzy. For humans, they wouldn't just be background figures in the distance, they would be part of daily life. Herds of these animals would move across open plains, stripping forests of leaves, flattening ground as they walked, leaving behind trails wider than rivers. A group of early humans trying to cross the same ground would find themselves weaving between footprints deep enough to swallow them whole. It would feel like walking through a land made for gods, except those gods were animals, eating, moving and living with no awareness of the fragile figures at their feet. Predators were just as immense in their own way. Tyrannosaurus, for example, wasn't the only giant carnivore of its time, but it was among the most fearsome. Standing 3 times the height of a person, armed with jaws that could crush through bone, it represented a threat that no human strategy could fully overcome. For people used to lions and leopards, the idea of something 10 times larger stalking them would have been overwhelming, and yet these predators weren't constant killers. They lived like any other animal, conserving energy, choosing battles carefully, feeding on carrion as much as hunting live prey. Humans might have avoided them by learning patterns, recognizing the signs of their presence, and moving away long before danger came close. Still, the fear would remain, a shadow in every open plain, a tension in every journey. The giants weren't only threats, some would be awe-inspiring in ways that invited curiosity rather than fear. Triceratops, with its horns and frill, would look strange and almost ceremonial, like an animal wearing armour. Humans might have told stories about such creatures, giving them symbolic roles in their cultures. To see one silhouetted against the horizon, horns catching the light, would be unforgettable. And yet awe always carried a price. Approaching too closely would mean risking a charge, a horn through the body, or being trampled under hooves. The Age of Giants wasn't gentle. It was a constant reminder that beauty and danger often came together. The landscape itself would be built around these animals. Forests would be shaped by constant feeding, open plains carved by migration paths, and even rivers would change course as herds trampled their banks. Humans would have to adapt to those rhythms. A valley that seemed fertile one season might be devastated the next as herds passed through and stripped it bare. A forest filled with fruit and shelter might become dangerous overnight if predators followed migrating dinosaurs into it. Human groups would need to move more often, reading the signs of giant movements the way we read weather. Entire patterns of survival would be written around the giants, their needs shaping the possibilities for human life. Food would be both scarce and abundant. On one hand, the sheer size of dinosaurs meant competition for plants and water would be intense. On the other, opportunities would open up in strange ways. The eggs of giant dinosaurs could feed a group for days. Carcasses left behind by predators would be feasts if people could reach them safely. Humans, always opportunistic, might have followed the trails of giants not to hunt them, but to scavenge from what they left behind. That strategy, risky as it was, could become central. The Age of Giants would not leave space for humans to dominate, but it would leave scraps, and sometimes scraps were enough to survive. Living in such a world would also mean dealing with constant noise. Imagine the sound of a herd of sauropods moving across open ground. The low rumble of their steps would carry for miles, shaking the earth underfoot. The calls of hadrosaurs, resonating like horns, would echo through valleys. Predators would roar, hiss, or bellow to mark territory or frighten rivals. For humans, sound would be both warning and background, so constant that silence itself would feel strange. Nights would be filled not with crickets or wolves, but with distant rumbles, the crash of trees, and the shifting of enormous bodies. Sleep would never feel fully secure. The giants would always be near, whether in sight or only in sound. Size also changes perception of time. Dinosaurs grew slowly compared to humans, some taking decades to reach full size. Their lifespans might stretch beyond what humans could imagine. To see the same giant year after year, wandering the same paths, would make them feel eternal, as if they had always been there and always would be. Humans, with their short lifespans and quick generations, might have seen themselves as temporary, passing quickly while the giants endured. That difference would influence culture deeply. People might see themselves as fleeting visitors, with the dinosaurs as the permanent residents of Earth. The danger of predators would force humans to become inventive in their footsteps. Traps might be designed not to catch dinosaurs, but to deter them, to create barriers of spikes or pits that redirected paths. Fire would be used not just to cook, but to scare. Loud noises, coordinated shouting, and displays of numbers might have been strategies to push predators away. None of these would guarantee safety, but they would create small pockets of survival in a world otherwise ruled by creatures beyond human scale. And then there's the question of what giants mean for imagination. Humans have always told stories about large creatures, dragons, monsters, and gods shaped like animals. In this world, no invention would be needed. The giants would be real, living alongside people every day. Stories might not exaggerate them at all, because the truth would already be unbelievable. Children would grow up hearing not myths but descriptions, passed down from those who saw a predator in the flesh, or watched herds darken the horizon. Imagination would merge with reality until the line between them disappeared. It's easy to think of this age as terrifying, but it would also be humbling. For humans to survive among such creatures, they would need to accept their limits. They could not conquer, only endure. They could not eliminate threats, only avoid them. That humility might have changed the trajectory of humanity itself. Instead of building toward domination of the Earth, people might have built toward harmony, seeking ways to live within boundaries set by giants. The very idea of control might never have taken root. Instead, coexistence, fragile and temporary, would define life. And yet, even in the shadow of giants, people would keep moving forward. Each fire lit, each tool sharpened, each shelter built would be a small victory. Each survival through the night would prove possible what seemed impossible. The giants would never go away, but humans would never stop trying. That persistence, even in the face of creatures that made them seem irrelevant, would be the quiet strength of their story. The age of giants would not crush humanity, but it would shape it, pressing every step into patterns of caution, respect, and stubborn endurance. So when we think about what it would mean for the first humans to live among dinosaurs, it isn't just about danger or scale, it's about perspective. Living among giants would have forced us to see ourselves differently, not as masters of the land, but as one small part of it, fragile yet determined, weak yet inventive. And perhaps that awareness, more than anything else, would define the path forward. When two stories are meant to stay apart, you can almost feel the strangeness of forcing them together. Dinosaurs and humans belong to different shelves in Earth's history, separated by more than 60 million years. Yet imagining them side by side means deliberately crossing timelines that were never supposed to meet. That act itself creates questions. What happens when the habits of one age collide with the instincts of another? What do people do when they suddenly find themselves standing in the middle of a drama that had already been running long before they arrived? Crossing timelines isn't only about picturing people next to dinosaurs, it's about picturing what it would mean to live in a story already in progress, one written by creatures who had no need for us. Dinosaurs had already solved the challenges of survival. They filled every niche on land, in water, and in the air. Some were predators perfected for speed, stealth, and precision. Others were plant-eaters designed to move in herds, stripping landscapes bare in coordinated movements that dwarfed anything a group of people could do. Still others soared overhead with wings wider than a small plane, shadowing the ground as they searched for food. Humans entering that world would have brought none of those perfected advantages. We would have entered not as equals but as strangers arriving late to a party already crowded. Crossing those timelines would have been like stepping onto a stage in the middle of a play, where the actors ignore you and the scenery towers above. The collision of eras would also create friction in daily survival. Humans carried fire, stone tools, and a growing sense of cooperation, but dinosaurs carried sheer presence. Picture a group of people building shelters from wood and leaves along the edge of a clearing. The work is quiet, the fire is prepared, children gather near their parents. Then the ground begins to tremble, not from thunder, but from the arrival of a herd moving through. Everything carefully built could be flattened in minutes, not out of malice, but from indifference. The giants would not even notice. Crossing timelines would mean living with the knowledge that your efforts were temporary, constantly vulnerable to being erased by creatures that didn't even recognize you existed. But friction also sparks adaptation. Humans are defined by their ability to learn quickly, to find patterns, and to change behavior based on experience. Placed alongside dinosaurs, those traits would have been tested harder than ever. People would need to learn migration paths, understand feeding grounds, and avoid predator territories with precision. The earliest maps, drawn not on paper but in memory, would have been less about rivers and mountains, and more about where the giants moved, where they fed, and where they hunted. Crossing timelines would have turned humans into cartographers of danger, marking the world not by opportunity but by threat. Cultural clashes would also appear. Our real ancestors told stories about the animals they lived with, weaving them into myths, symbols, and rituals. In this altered world, the scale of those stories would change. Instead of tales of lions or mammoths, people would speak of creatures taller than trees, with teeth that gleamed in the firelight. Rituals might revolve around asking protection from the giants, songs might imitate their calls, and carvings might preserve their shapes. Human imagination thrives on the unfamiliar, and dinosaurs would provide endless material. Crossing timelines would not only affect survival, it would shape identity. People would see themselves not just as survivors of nature, but as witnesses to beings that seemed eternal. The everyday conflicts would extend to resources as well. Humans and dinosaurs would compete for food and water in ways that could not be balanced easily. A herd of hadrosaurs could strip a riverbank bare in hours, leaving nothing for people. Carnivores might descend on the same prey humans hunted, scattering them or stealing the kill outright. Even plant gathering would be risky, because many of the plants people might eat would also feed smaller dinosaurs, and those dinosaurs might themselves be prey for larger ones. A simple act like picking fruit could place humans in the middle of a chain reaction of attention, noise, and danger. Crossing timelines would mean constantly weaving through conflicts that could never be resolved. And yet, despite the imbalance, there would be moments of strange opportunity. Dinosaurs, for all their size, were still animals. They lived, fed, and moved in patterns. Humans might have learned to follow behind herds, scavenging from what they left behind. They might have taken advantage of predator kills, risking danger to claim scraps of meat. They might even have learned to time their movements with the rhythms of the giants, crossing valleys only after herds had passed, gathering food in the gaps left between migrations. Crossing timelines would be dangerous, but it would also teach people how to read the Earth with more precision than ever before. Another clash comes from the different speeds of life. Dinosaurs lived on a scale of decades, sometimes longer, while humans lived faster, reproducing and spreading more quickly. Over time, that difference might create tension in ways subtle but important. Dinosaurs would dominate space, but humans would dominate time. Generation after generation would pass for people, while the same dinosaur still walked the same paths. Each new group of humans would learn from the last, building layers of knowledge about creatures that seemed unchanging. In that way, crossing timelines would give humans a strange advantage, not in strength, but in memory. It's also worth considering what dinosaurs might make of people. Most probably wouldn't notice us at all, too small and insignificant to matter. Predators might view us as potential prey, but even then the energy gained from a single human would be hardly worth the effort compared to larger animals. That indifference would be its own kind of danger. People would have to live with the knowledge that they were not hunted for sport or for rivalry, but simply ignored. In some ways that would feel worse, to be so insignificant in the eyes of the world's rulers. Crossing timelines would teach humility through neglect as much as through threat. Humans, however, are rarely content with insignificance. They would have found ways to make themselves matter, even if only in small pockets. Fire, sound, and numbers would help them carve out tiny spaces of recognition. Predators might begin to avoid groups that shouted and brandished flames. Smaller dinosaurs might learn to scavenge from human camps, creating relationships that were neither friendly nor hostile, but pragmatic. Over time, these interactions would add up, not rewriting the balance of power but nudging it slightly, enough to carve out niches of survival. Crossing timelines would not turn humans into rulers, but it would let them become participants, part of the story instead of footnotes. The psychological impact would be immense. Humans are storytellers, and living with dinosaurs would make those stories larger, darker, and stranger. Every generation would grow up hearing warnings, descriptions, and legends of creatures beyond comprehension. Those stories would carry not only fear, but also fascination. Children would draw shapes in dirt, imitate calls, and imagine what it would mean to ride or tame such creatures. Even in fear, imagination would stretch toward curiosity. Crossing timelines would not erase wonder, it would fuel it. And perhaps most importantly, crossing timelines would blur the sense of destiny. In our world, humans eventually became dominant, reshaping Earth around themselves. But in this world, With dinosaurs still present, dominance would never be guaranteed. People would live knowing that the world could not be bent entirely to their will. They would always share it with forces larger and older. That awareness might have created a very different sense of purpose, one not about mastery but about endurance. Crossing timelines wouldn't end humanity, but it would change what humanity meant. The collision of ages shows us something simple but profound. Our place in history is fragile. Move the pieces slightly and the story changes. Imagine us among dinosaurs, and you see how much of our survival depends on timing, luck, and circumstance. Crossing timelines is more than fantasy. It's a reminder that we are shaped not only by what happened, but by what didn't. Picture the first fire, not as a spark in a textbook or a neat experiment in a laboratory, but as a real flame breaking the darkness for a small band of people who had nothing else to shield them from the night. In our real history, that fire was enough to scare away lions, hyenas, and leopards, to keep the cold at bay, and to cook the meat that otherwise would have been dangerous to eat. Now shift that same scene into a world filled with dinosaurs, and the meaning of that flame changes completely. Around it, fragile humans gather close, children pressed into the arms of parents, hunters setting down their spears for the evening. And above them, far beyond the reach of their firelight, the shadow of a sauropod drifts slowly by, its massive frame blotting out the stars as it reaches for leaves higher than the firelight could ever reach. That image alone captures what it would mean to live in this crossed world. People, tiny and fragile, huddled under a campfire, and giants moving around them as if they didn't even exist. The campfire was more than light. It was a centre, a boundary that turned a patch of open ground into a circle of safety. In a land of dinosaurs, that safety would always feel uncertain. The crackle of flames would push back the shadows, but what could a flame do against a creature weighing tens of tons? The fire wouldn't keep a sauropod away. It wouldn't even be noticed. A giant might step too close, its enormous foot pressing into the soil just beyond the circle, and no amount of shouting or waving torches would matter. To the sauropod, humans were irrelevant. It would reach down, strip leaves, chew slowly, and move on, leaving the people to sit in stunned silence as the ground trembled beneath them. The campfire under a sauropod was both a symbol of human resilience and a reminder of human insignificance. For predators, though, the fire meant more. Raptors, tyrannosaurs, and other hunters understood fear, and flames could hold them back. The fire became a weapon not by strength but by psychology. A predator hesitating at the edge of the light would give people time to ready spears, to scream together, to create the illusion of power. That illusion might be enough to survive, at least for the night. Around the fire, humans learned that together they could be more than prey. The fire was the tool that turned scattered individuals into a unit, a force that could stand, however briefly, against a world much larger than themselves. The campfire also carried meaning in quieter ways. Food prepared there didn't just nourish, it created shared experience. In a dinosaur world, cooking meat meant drawing predators closer, so people would have to cook quickly, eat fast, and cover their scent with smoke. Still, that act of gathering around flame created community. The stories told there, whispered while giants moved in the dark, would carry weight. A parent describing the dangers of a valley, a hunter explaining the tracks he'd seen, a child asking what the rumble in the distance meant. All of it would become memory and culture. The campfire under a sauropod wasn't only about heat and light. It was about learning, warning, and passing knowledge to make survival possible. Imagine the smell of such a night. Smoke drifting into the air, blending with the heavy scent of plants trampled by sauropod feet. The musk of enormous bodies moving close by. The sharper odour of predators circling farther out. For humans, every smell was a message. Smoke meant warmth, but it also meant risk of detection. The smell of dung meant herds had passed and danger might follow. The faint odour of decay meant a carcass nearby, a temptation that could bring predators at any moment. The senses sharpened by firelight would create a constant awareness that survival was fragile. Sitting by the campfire under a sauropod, every breath would be filled with reminders that the world was not theirs. The fire itself was fragile too. Rain could put it out, wind could scatter embers, a careless hand could burn food or destroy tools. Protecting the fire became as important as protecting the group. In this alternate world, fire might be carried constantly, guarded like a living thing. People might have kept torches burning even as they walked, ensuring that the spark never died. Losing fire in a land of dinosaurs would mean losing safety, losing the boundary between life and the dark beyond. That responsibility would shape behaviour, creating rituals around tending the flames, passing coals from one camp to the next, and teaching children never to let it die. The presence of a sauropod near the fire adds something else: scale. Sitting beneath a creature larger than any building they could imagine, humans would feel the weight of comparison. Their fire, no matter how carefully fed, was a flicker against the massive bulk moving overhead. That contrast would teach humility, but also determination. The campfire didn't need to match the sauropod. It only needed to hold back the night enough for people to live another day. The comparison would not break them. It would remind them of their role. They were not giants, but they were survivors, and sometimes survival was enough. But the campfire wasn't always safe. The light might attract predators instead of scaring them. The smell of cooked meat might draw scavengers. Even the glow could make humans visible in the dark. Sitting by the fire meant constant vigilance, with lookouts scanning the shadows for movement. A branch snapping too close could send the group scrambling, spears raised, hearts pounding. The fire gave comfort, but it also gave away position. That tension between safety and risk defined life in this altered world. Every campfire was a gamble, a hope that light would protect more than it exposed, and yet people would keep lighting them. No matter the risk, the need for warmth, food, and community outweighed the dangers. Around those flames, humans forged bonds that predators and giants could not erase. They learned to coordinate, to share, to dream. The campfire under a sauropod became not just survival, but the beginning of culture. It was the place where ideas formed, where questions were asked, where plans were made. In the shadows of dinosaurs, humans learned to be more than individuals. They became groups, families, and eventually societies. The sauropod itself, massive and indifferent, might never have noticed the fire at its feet. To humans, though, its presence would become legend. Stories would grow about the night the fire burned while a giant walked past. Some would say the sauropod was a guardian, a creature too vast to fear. Others would warn that it could crush them without realizing. Over time, such encounters would shape myths and beliefs. The sauropod under the stars, moving slowly past a circle of light, would live on in memory long after the fire burned out. For children, these moments would be formative. Sitting close to parents, hearing the rumble of footsteps above, they would grow up knowing that giants walk the earth with them. The fire would be their first lesson in safety, the sauropod their first lesson in scale. Those experiences would shape how they saw the world. They would not think of themselves as rulers, but as survivors in a shared space, fragile but resilient. The campfire under a sauropod was not just a scene. It was the foundation of a worldview. Every detail of that night would matter. The way sparks drifted upward, mirroring stars hidden by the bulk of the giant above. The way shadows stretched and shifted as the firelight flickered against massive legs. The way silence fell whenever the sauropod paused, chewing slowly, breathing deeply. For humans, those details would become memory etched into survival. The fire was fragile, the people were small, but together they endured, even as giants passed by. In the end, the campfire under a sauropod captures the essence of this imagined world. Humans, small and vulnerable, clinging to the tools they had. Dinosaurs, vast and indifferent, moving through their own patterns. The two timelines crossing not in battle, but in coexistence, however uneasy. And through it all, the fire remained, a symbol of human persistence, a spark that refused to die even in the shadow of creatures that should have erased it. There was always something waiting just outside the circle of firelight. For early humans, the edges of vision were filled with eyes, the glint of predators that lived in the dark. In our world, those eyes belonged to lions, leopards, or hyenas. In a world where humans walked with dinosaurs, those edges would hold far greater dangers. Raptors, tyrannosaurs, and other carnivores would circle the camp, drawn by scent, by sound, by the movement of small figures huddled close together. Predators at the edge weren't just a threat. They were the constant reminder that survival was never certain. Predators shaped behaviour in every way. A group might plan its movements based on where tracks were seen or where carcasses were left behind. People might whisper warnings about a valley where footsteps thundered too often, or a clearing where bones always seemed fresh. Fear wasn't a weakness here. It was a tool, a sense sharpened by generations of experience. The presence of predators at the edge made humans cautious, deliberate, and endlessly inventive. The fear never went away, but it became the pressure that forced progress. Think about the difference in scale. A lion weighs a couple 100 kilograms, powerful enough to kill a human in seconds. A raptor, depending on the species, could be twice that size, armed with claws designed to slice through bone. A tyrannosaur could weigh thousands of kilograms, its head alone bigger than a person's entire body. For humans, fighting back directly would be impossible. Even with fire and spears, the risk was overwhelming. The only real strategy was avoidance. That meant reading signs better than anyone else. A snapped branch, a fresh footprint, a smell on the wind. All of it mattered. Missing one clue could mean being surrounded before you even knew danger was near. Predators at the edge didn't only hunt, they tested. Raptors in particular were intelligent, capable of working in groups, coordinating movements and probing defences. A human camp with fire might seem safe, but a raptor could watch from the shadows, waiting for a mistake. A child wandering too far, a fire burning low, or a hunter stepping out alone to relieve himself in the dark could be enough. The edge of the firelight wasn't a boundary, it was a challenge. Humans had to prove, every night, that they could defend it. This constant tension changed how people lived. Sleep became lighter, broken by sudden starts at noises outside. Watches were kept, with pairs of people staying awake to guard the camp. Children learned silence early, trained not to cry out at every sound. Even play during the day might be restricted, kept close to adults, because predators didn't only hunt at night. A hunt could happen at dawn, or in the middle of the afternoon if hunger demanded it. For humans, predators at the edge meant living in a state of constant readiness, never fully relaxed, never entirely safe. Yet there was another side to this pressure. Humans who survived learned quickly. Stories of attacks would be told and retold, embedding lessons in memory. A warning about how a hunter was dragged away after stepping beyond the light became a rule for the next generation. Each encounter, no matter how deadly, became knowledge. That accumulation of experience built resilience. Predators at the edge forced humans to evolve not just physically, but culturally, shaping traditions, habits, and rituals. In that sense, predators became teachers, though the lessons were harsh. There would have been strategies beyond fire. Humans might have built barriers of sharpened stakes, creating walls around their camps to slow an attack. They might have used noise, shouting, drumming, striking stones together to create confusion. They might even have turned to traps, digging pits or setting snares not to kill predators, but to discourage them. None of these would guarantee safety, but combined they could tip the balance just enough. Predators at the edge were relentless, but humans were persistent, and persistence often makes the difference between extinction and survival. It's also worth considering how predators saw humans. To a tyrannosaur, a single person might not be worth the effort compared to larger prey. To raptors, though, humans could look like manageable targets, small and vulnerable but dangerous in groups. Predators might have learned quickly that humans were not easy meals, that fire and cooperation made them unpredictable. Some predators might have avoided humans entirely, while others might have specialized in hunting them. The relationship would have been complex, a cycle of testing, avoiding, and sometimes succeeding. For humans, this meant living in uncertainty. They never knew whether the edge of the light held disinterest or determination. The edge wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Living with predators so close created a constant tension that shaped how people thought. Imagination filled the darkness with threats, even when none were present. Every sound became suspicious, every shadow a potential attack. That stress could be exhausting, but it also made people sharper. Hyper-awareness became part of survival, a skill passed down as naturally as walking or eating. Predators at the edge taught humans to see patterns in chaos, to expect danger even when none appeared. That habit of vigilance may have carried forward into everything else they did. The predators also changed the way humans viewed the land. A valley wasn't just fertile or barren, it was safe or dangerous. A river wasn't only a source of water, it was a hunting ground for carnivores. People might have built mental maps not of where resources were, but of where predators lingered. Those maps would guide movement, migration, and even culture, and entire groups might avoid regions known for certain predators, creating invisible boundaries across the world. Predators at the edge didn't only hunt, they shaped the geography of human life. Predators could even change the way humans interacted with each other. Fear made cooperation essential. A lone wanderer was a dead wanderer, so groups stuck together. Disputes might be set aside in the face of shared danger. Firewood was gathered more quickly, camps built more carefully, because hesitation meant exposure. In some cases, predators might have pushed groups to merge, creating large communities that could better defend against attack. The edge of the firelight, in that sense, was a place where not only fear lived, but where human society itself began to take shape. The relationship with predators wasn't only hostility. Humans are observant, and they might have learned from predators too. Watching raptors hunt could teach lessons about coordination. Watching tyrannosaurs scavenge could inspire new strategies for finding food. Even the behavior of predators circling the edge of camp might reveal patterns useful for defense. People would not only fear predators, they would study them, incorporating what they saw into their own survival. Predators at the edge were threats, but they were also models of how to succeed in a harsh world. Imagine a specific night. The fire burns low, embers glowing instead of flames. A group of humans huddles close, whispering, trying not to draw attention. Just beyond the circle, eyes glint in the dark. The sound of claws scrapes against stone. A raptor watches, shifting its weight, considering. The humans tense, spears ready, voices hushed. A decision is made, not to fight, not to flee, but to throw a burning branch outward. The predator hesitates, startled, then slinks back into the shadows. Relief washes over the group, but the fear doesn't vanish. They know it will return. This is what life with predators at the edge meant. Not one victory, not one escape, but an endless cycle of tension, defense, and survival. The edge was never fixed. It moved with the fire, with the people, with the predators themselves. Sometimes the edge felt close, pressing in with every sound. Other times it felt far, the night quiet, the danger distant. But it was always there, a boundary that reminded humans they were never alone. That awareness shaped everything, from how they built shelters to how they told stories. Predators at the edge weren't only creatures of flesh and bone, they became symbols of danger, of vigilance, of the unknown. Over time, those symbols grew into myths. A predator that circled the fire one night might become a story passed down for generations, its features exaggerated, its danger magnified. Children would grow up hearing those stories, internalizing the lessons long before they faced real danger. The myths didn't replace reality, they reinforced it. Predators at the edge lived in both worlds, the physical and the imagined, and in both they shaped humanity. And through it all, people kept surviving. The fire kept burning, the spears kept being sharpened, the lookouts kept watching. Predators at the edge never disappeared, but neither did humans. The balance remained fragile, but persistence carried the day. Every escape, every avoided attack, every night that ended with dawn instead of death was a reminder that survival was possible. The predators taught fear, but they also taught resilience. And in the end, resilience was the one advantage humans could always rely on. Scale defines perspective. For early humans, standing next to a mammoth or an elephant already created a sense of smallness. But in a world with dinosaurs, that feeling would multiply until it became a constant condition of life. Tiny people surrounded by huge neighbours would not be a rare sight, but the ordinary state of existence. No matter where they walked, worked, or rested, humans would always be under the shadow of creatures so large they made shelters look like toys, and fire circles look like sparks. The sense of being small would not fade with time. It would settle into the very identity of what it meant to be human. Imagine walking through a valley where a herd of sauropods is grazing. Each neck sways above like a moving tower, heads plucking leaves as easily as a child might pick berries. A human standing at their feet would barely come up to the joint of one leg. The ground would shake with every step they took, and yet they would move slowly, almost gently, with no awareness of the figures darting like insects below. For people, the feeling would be contradictory. Awe and fear mixing together. The recognition that survival depended not on mastering these neighbours, but on avoiding being crushed by them accidentally. To live tiny among huge neighbours meant existing at the margins of awareness, never acknowledged, never fully ignored. The sheer size of dinosaurs reshaped how humans would measure the world. Distances were larger because a herd could block an entire valley, forcing detours of days. Time itself stretched differently because giants moved slowly, their lives spanning decades, while human generations passed quickly in comparison. Shelter meant one thing for humans, a small barrier against wind and rain, but dinosaurs created natural shelters simply by standing, their bulk breaking wind currents, their presence altering landscapes. The comparison would never end. Every act of survival humans attempted would feel small in the context of their neighbour's scale. But being tiny also meant being overlooked. Predators hunted with precision, but not every dinosaur was interested in small prey. A tyrannosaur might see a human as too little food to bother with unless opportunity presented itself. A sauropod might never register a human's presence at all. That invisibility could become a form of safety. Humans might slip between herds, moving unseen, gathering resources in the gaps left behind. They would become experts at using size to their advantage, learning to disappear into landscapes that giants could not navigate. Being tiny among huge neighbours wasn't only a disadvantage, it could be a shield if used wisely. Daily life would reflect that tension. Collecting water might mean waiting while a herd of hadrosaurs finished drinking, because pushing forward would be suicide. Hunting smaller dinosaurs would require timing, striking when larger ones were absent, retreating before predators noticed. Even something as simple as gathering wood could be disrupted by the crash of a tail through the undergrowth, forcing people to scatter. Everything was conditional on the movements of neighbours so large they could not be resisted. Human footsteps were careful, planned, always guided by the awareness that they were not the main characters in their environment. Children would grow up with this perspective woven into their understanding of the world. From the beginning, they would learn that survival depended on recognizing scale. They would hear warnings not to wander where herds gathered, not to linger in open spaces where predators could see them, not to mistake curiosity for safety. Play might take place near shelters or within forests too dense for giants to enter, always under the watchful eyes of adults. Childhood itself would be shorter in such a world, because children would be forced to learn discipline and caution, almost as soon as they could walk. To be tiny meant growing up faster, because mistakes carried costs too great to allow for second chances. This imbalance of size would also shape human imagination. Giants naturally inspire stories. Around fires, people would describe the neighbours they saw, sometimes in detail, sometimes exaggerated until the creatures seemed almost supernatural. Tales would form about how the earth itself created giants, about what they meant, about why people were so small in comparison. Some stories might give the giants divine roles. Others might frame them as tests, challenges placed on the world to force people into cleverness. Either way, being tiny in a land of giants would make storytelling essential. Words became the only way to stretch human scale to match what eyes could not fully grasp. Practical survival required more than stories. Groups might learn to track giant movements, not to hunt them, but to avoid them. They would mark safe routes through forests, noting where herds never passed. They would build shelters in caves or against cliffs, places too narrow or steep for dinosaurs to follow. They might even time their migrations with the absence of certain species, slipping into valleys during seasons when herds moved elsewhere. The giants dictated the rhythm of life, and humans responded with strategies designed to minimize contact. Being tiny didn't mean being helpless. It meant becoming experts in reading and responding to patterns. Still, accidents would happen. A human group might settle too close to a path used by sauropods, waking one morning to find their camp flattened. A hunting party might be caught between a predator and its prey, trampled in the chaos of pursuit. These losses would be devastating, but they would also become lessons. Survivors would tell the stories, pass down warnings, and reshape habits. Over time, a cultural memory would form, a collective understanding of where not to step, what not to do, and how to live alongside neighbours too large to challenge. That cultural memory would extend into art. Carvings might show humans beside towering creatures, emphasizing scale as the defining relationship. Songs might imitate the deep calls of giants, preserving the sounds as part of tradition. Paintings, if they ever developed, might feature not only animals, but the contrast between small figures and overwhelming presences. Living tiny among huge neighbours would make comparison unavoidable, and comparison would become expression. Culture itself would grow out of the need to understand and represent the imbalance of size. The question of tools becomes more interesting here. Spears, axes, and fire were powerful against animals closer to human scale, but against giants they were useless. That realization would shift the role of tools from direct confrontation to indirect survival. A spear might kill a smaller dinosaur, providing food, but against a sauropod it was a stick thrown at a wall of flesh. Fire could scare predators, but it would do nothing to a creature indifferent to danger. Humans would learn quickly that their tools were not weapons for dominance, but aids for living within limits. That awareness might prevent the illusion of mastery from ever taking hold. People would see themselves as tool users, yes, but not as rulers. The giants reminded them of that every day. Communication between groups would reflect this too. Stories of neighbours encountered would be shared when groups met, forming a wider network of knowledge. The valley beyond the ridge belongs to the horned ones. The river is unsafe in the dry season because predators gather there. Information wasn't just useful, it was essential. Being tiny meant relying on others, because no group could map the entire landscape alone. Cooperation became survival, and survival depended on sharing what was known about the giants that dominated every region. Even in awe, there would be moments of unexpected beauty. A group might pause at dawn, watching a herd move slowly across a plain, their silhouettes blocking the rising sun. A parent might hold a child on their shoulders, pointing out the massive forms, explaining which ones to fear and which to avoid. Those moments would stay in memory, not because they were safe, but because they were unforgettable. Living tiny among huge neighbours didn't only mean danger, it also meant being surrounded by a kind of grandeur that reshaped how people saw the world. The giants were threats, but they were also wonders. That wonder, however, could never erase the reality of risk. A single misstep could bring catastrophe. A person wandering into the path of a herd might be crushed before they even realised danger was near. A predator might spot movement and decide just this once that the effort was worth it. Every day, survival depended on balancing awe with caution, curiosity with restraint. Being tiny meant always walking that line, never able to forget that the world belonged to others first. Over generations, humans might have developed physical changes in response to this environment. Greater agility, faster reflexes, sharper senses, all could be selected for in a world where giants and predators defined the risks. Intelligence might grow even faster because cleverness offered the best chance of survival when size offered none. Being tiny forced people to rely on brains rather than brawn, a pressure that could have accelerated the path toward advanced thought. The giants wouldn't just shape culture, they might shape evolution itself. Living among huge neighbours also raises questions about long-term survival. Would people eventually learn to coexist peacefully, carving out a niche that didn't threaten the giants? Or would they always remain on the margins, too fragile to ever expand fully? The answer might lie in persistence. Dinosaurs were vast and powerful, but humans multiplied quickly, spread widely, and adapted constantly. Over thousands of years, those traits could allow them to expand despite the odds. Being tiny meant progress was slow, but progress was possible. The giants might dominate the landscape, but people could dominate time, generation after generation carrying knowledge forward. At the heart of it all was perspective. To live tiny among huge neighbours meant seeing the world through a lens of humility, recognising that survival depended on respecting limits. Every campfire, every shelter, every hunt was framed by the knowledge that something larger always existed nearby. And yet, within that smallness was resilience. Humans didn't need to be the biggest to endure. They only needed to be persistent, clever, and connected. The giants reminded them of their place, but they also reminded them of their strength. For humans, tools have always been the equalizer. A sharp stone, a wooden spear, a carefully tended fire. These gave our ancestors a way to balance the scales against animals stronger, faster, and better armed by nature. But in a world where dinosaurs were the competition, those same tools would suddenly feel small, almost laughably small, when compared to the teeth and claws of the predators they faced. Tools versus teeth wasn't just a practical question. It was the daily reality of survival, the constant measure of whether cleverness could ever be enough against raw power. Take a stone spear. Against a deer, it could pierce flesh and bring down dinner. Against a lion, wielded in numbers, it could drive the animal back. But against a tyrannosaur, the spear was an insect sting. A thrust into thick scales and muscle wouldn't stop an animal weighing several tons. Even a successful strike would be lost in the sheer bulk of the predator. The human carrying the spear would know instinctively that the tool was not a weapon, but a gesture, a last-ditch attempt if cornered. That knowledge would shape behaviour. Spears were useful for hunting and defence against smaller predators, but never against the rulers of the land. The teeth always won when size grew too great. Still, tools had a power that teeth lacked. They were versatile. A predator's claws and jaws were fixed, designed for one purpose. A human tool could be chipped, shaped, improved, and replaced. Fire could be carried. Spears could be hardened. Axes could split wood or butcher meat. The advantage wasn't strength, it was adaptability. People could think, and thinking let them turn weakness into a strategy. When teeth outmatched tools in direct confrontation, tools shifted the battlefield into areas where brains mattered more than brute force. Picture a group of humans facing smaller predators like raptors. Alone, each person was vulnerable. Together, armed with sharpened sticks and stones, they could form a circle, spears pointing outward, fire in the centre. Raptors testing the defence might lunge, but a coordinated thrust could wound one, drive it back, maybe even kill it if the strike was lucky. The carcass could then serve as both food and proof that the tools worked. That victory would be rare, costly, but unforgettable. The lesson wasn't that humans could win easily, but that they could win at all. Every successful defence would reinforce faith in tools, making them central to survival even when they seemed fragile. Fire was the greatest tool of all, more than any spear or axe. Predators feared flame in ways they didn't fear sharp stone. A burning torch waved in the night could hold back even a determined hunter, creating distance where none existed before. Fire spread through grass, through leaves, through wood, turning the land itself into a shield. In a world of dinosaurs, fire might have been the only true advantage humans held. It couldn't kill giants, but it could frighten, redirect, and protect. Teeth were powerful, but teeth feared flame. That fear gave people space to live another day. But even fire had limits. A predator too hungry might charge through it, ignoring pain to reach prey. Rain could extinguish flames, wind could scatter sparks into dangerous places, and giants like sauropods wouldn't notice at all, their bulk too immense to care. Humans had to learn quickly that fire was not invincible. It was a tool, fragile like themselves, requiring constant tending. The match between tools and teeth was never final, always precarious, always shifting with circumstance. Over time, though, humans would refine their tools. Spears hardened by fire, stone blades sharpened to perfection, weapons designed for throwing rather than thrusting. All of these developments widened the gap. Predators relied on instinct. Humans relied on memory. Each failed defense became a lesson, each success an experiment. Slowly, across generations, the balance would shift. Not in absolute terms, teeth still outmatched flesh, but in survival terms. Humans began to create situations where their tools could matter more than raw strength. Traps, barriers, and ambushes became ways to make small weapons effective against larger threats. Teeth could crush bone, but only if the predator reached its prey. Tools could change the ground itself to prevent that from happening. It's worth remembering how psychological these contests were. A predator testing a human group wasn't just measuring physical danger, it was measuring the strange new behaviour of creatures that shouted, waved fire, and struck with sharp edges. Many predators might have decided the risk wasn't worth the reward. The teeth were strong, but teeth could not reason. Tools could create illusions of power, of numbers, of unpredictability. That unpredictability might have been the most valuable weapon humans possessed. In the clash of tools versus teeth, unpredictability could sometimes outweigh strength. The difference between the two also shaped human identity. Teeth are natural, unchanging, part of the body. Tools are made, carried, chosen. Humans learned to see themselves not as bare creatures, but as beings defined by what they could create. In a dinosaur world, that identity would only grow stronger. People would tell stories not only about predators they feared, but about the tools that saved them. A spear that wounded a raptor, a fire that drove off a tyrannosaur. These became symbols of resilience. Tools were not just objects. They were extensions of humanity itself, proof that brains could carve a place in a world where flesh alone was never enough. The clash also reveals how fragile humans were. Teeth could kill instantly, while tools required effort, precision, and cooperation. A broken spear, a dropped torch, or a sudden rainstorm could undo everything. Survival was always on the edge of failure. That fragility might have taught people a kind of humility. They could never forget that their tools were small compared to the forces they faced. But humility didn't mean defeat. It meant persistence, the willingness to keep making, keep trying, keep improving, even when the odds seemed impossible. Imagine a scene in detail. A group of hunters tracks a small dinosaur, hoping to bring it down for food. They move quietly, spears ready, fire left behind at camp. Suddenly the brush shakes and a larger predator emerges. Teeth glint in the sunlight, claws rake the earth. The hunters freeze, knowing their weapons are useless in a direct fight. One throws a spear anyway, striking the predator's side. It roars, angered but startled. The humans scatter, regrouping at a distance, shouting, waving their arms. The predator hesitates, confused by the noise and the unexpected strike. Finally it turns away, seeking easier prey. The hunters return, shaken but alive. Their tools did not kill, but they created just enough disruption to survive. That is what tools meant in this world. Not dominance, but the chance to live another day. Over generations, these contests would define human culture. Songs might be sung about the night the fire held, about the spear that struck true, about the trap that worked. Children would be taught how to sharpen stone, how to keep fire alive, how to use noise to scare predators. Tools became not only practical but sacred, symbols of the thin line between life and death. Teeth were reminders of danger, but tools were reminders of hope. The balance between them was never even, but it was enough. And perhaps that is the real lesson. In a world where dinosaurs reigned, humans could never rely on strength. Teeth would always be sharper, jaws always stronger, claws always faster. But tools allowed flexibility. They gave humans a way to respond, to adapt, to turn weakness into strategy. Tools never won outright, but they kept people alive, and in the long run, survival was victory enough. Every part of the earth is shaped by the creatures that live on it. In our real history, humans shared their landscapes with mammoths, aurochs, lions, and countless smaller animals. They competed with some, cooperated with others, and eventually bent the land itself to their needs. In a world where humans walked beside dinosaurs, the concept of a shared landscape would be transformed into something entirely different. The balance of power would never be equal. People would never shape the land outright. Instead, they would carve out narrow niches, surviving in the spaces left behind by giants that ruled every forest, river and plain. Walking across such a land meant entering a world already claimed. A valley lush with ferns and cycads might seem inviting, but to step into it would mean stepping into the feeding ground of a herd of hadrosaurs. A river that sparkled in the sun might promise fish and drinking water, but on its banks predators gathered, waiting for prey to approach. A clearing that seemed ideal for a camp could be trampled overnight by sauropods moving through on their endless search for food. For humans, the land was never empty. It was always filled, always claimed, always shared, though never equally. That imbalance shaped the rhythms of life. Humans moved cautiously, not in straight lines, but in patterns dictated by the presence of dinosaurs. Migration paths weren't chosen based on preference but on necessity, following trails that avoided the densest herds and the hungriest predators. Shelters were built not where the land looked most fertile, but where cliffs, swamps, or dense forests made access difficult for giants. Each decision about where to walk, where to rest, where to gather food, was filtered through the awareness of neighbours too large to ignore. The shared landscape wasn't cooperative, it was negotiated every single day. Consider water, one of the most essential resources of all. Humans needed it constantly, but so did the giants. At a riverbank, people might crouch low, waiting for herds to drink before daring to approach. Tracks pressed deep into the mud showed not only where water could be found, but also where danger gathered. A careless step into that space could bring an entire group face to face with a predator lying in wait. Humans might have learned to seek smaller streams, hidden springs, or places overlooked by giants, choosing safety over abundance. The shared landscape forced them to trade efficiency for survival. always looking for narrow spaces where their small size could give them an advantage. Food presented the same challenge. Dinosaurs consumed plants on a scale humans could never match. A herd of sauropods could strip an entire valley of leaves within days, leaving behind bare branches and flattened soil. For people, that meant constant scarcity. They might have turned to different foods entirely: roots, insects, small reptiles, or the eggs of dinosaurs themselves. But even those choices carried risk. Digging for roots in the wrong place could bring predators sniffing. Taking eggs could provoke defensive parents. The act of eating was never simple in this world. Every mouthful carried calculation. Every gathering trip carried danger. And yet, despite the imbalance, humans did find ways to fit themselves into the landscape. Their smallness allowed them to move through forests too dense for larger creatures, to climb rocks, to swim narrow channels. Where dinosaurs needed space, humans needed little. That flexibility created niches of safety and abundance invisible to giants. A fallen log might be an obstacle to a dinosaur, but a shelter for people. A rocky overhang might mean nothing to a predator, but could serve as a home for a human group. The shared landscape was uneven, but it wasn't hopeless. People could survive by occupying the cracks, the corners, the overlooked places where giants couldn't reach. The giants themselves shaped the land in ways that indirectly helped humans. Trails left behind by herds became paths through forests. Clearings created by feeding became temporary fields where sunlight reached the ground. Carcasses left by predators became sources of food, tools, and even clothing if humans learned to use them. Even dung might provide fuel or fertilizer. Living in a shared landscape meant using every resource, even those left behind by the giants. In a sense, humans became scavengers not only of food, but of opportunity, finding use in what dinosaurs abandoned. But the danger never disappeared. Sharing a landscape meant constant vulnerability. A predator's hunt could sweep through a human camp, scattering people in every direction. A herd's migration could crush shelters without noticing them. Storms and floods would add chaos to an already precarious life, forcing groups to move quickly and adapt constantly. To live in a shared landscape was to live without guarantees. No place was fully safe, no resource fully secure. Humans endured not by eliminating danger, but by learning to accept it as part of existence. This acceptance shaped identity. People began to see themselves not as rulers of the land, but as participants in a system much larger than themselves. They didn't bend the earth to their will. They learned to read its signs, to understand its patterns, to adapt when those patterns shifted. Their stories reflected this awareness. Around fires, they spoke not of conquering the land, but of surviving within it. The giants were not villains, but neighbours, dangerous and indifferent, yet constant presences that gave the world its shape. To share a landscape was to acknowledge that no one owned it fully. Over time, humans might have developed an almost symbiotic relationship with their neighbours. They followed herds to scavenge what was left behind. They watched predators to learn where food could be found. They even benefited from the changes giants made to the land, using clearings and paths created without intention. The relationship was unequal but functional. People didn't control the landscape, but they learned to navigate it, turning the giant's power into opportunities whenever possible. Children raised in this world would grow up with that awareness built into them. They would play in the shadows of herds, hearing the ground shake with footsteps too large to imitate. They would learn early that curiosity could be fatal, that wandering into the wrong space meant never returning. Their sense of scale would be different from ours. They wouldn't marvel at the size of giants because the giants were ordinary. What would astonish them instead were the small spaces that kept them alive, the cave that sheltered them, the spring hidden from herds, the firelight circle that predators didn't cross. For them, survival was not about expansion, but about discovery of niches. The shared landscape also raised moral questions. If humans found dinosaur eggs and took them for food, did they risk drawing the fury of a parent? If they scavenged a carcass, did they steal from predators that still claimed it? Decisions were never straightforward. They were gambles, weighing hunger against risk, need against safety. Entire cultural rules might have grown from these dilemmas, guiding when it was safe to take, when it was wise to wait, and when it was better to move on. The shared landscape wasn't only physical, it was ethical, shaping choices and consequences every day. Despite the constant imbalance, humans endured. They survived not by dominating, but by adapting, not by claiming, but by sharing. Their resilience came from flexibility, from the willingness to accept limits and find opportunities within them. The shared landscape never offered guarantees, but it offered possibilities, and humans learned to see those possibilities even in the shadows of giants. In the end, the image is simple. A group of people moving through a valley, small figures among towering herds, firelight glowing faintly against the dark. They know they cannot control the land. They know they are not the largest, the strongest, or the most fearsome, but they also know they can endure. The landscape is not theirs alone, but it is theirs enough to survive, and survival, in a world ruled by giants, is the greatest achievement of all. Sound carries more than information. For early humans, sound was survival itself. The crack of a branch meant a predator nearby. The call of a bird meant water or food. The rustle of grass in the wind could mean nothing, or it could mean something dangerous moving silently. In our world, these sounds defined how people lived, where they went, and what they feared. But in a world where humans lived with dinosaurs, the entire soundtrack of existence would change. The sounds of that world would be overwhelming, constant, and unforgettable. Imagine the low thunder of footsteps from a herd of sauropods. Not the single thud of an elephant walking across a plain, but dozens of legs striking the ground with the rhythm of distant drums. The earth itself would vibrate, shaking through the bones of anyone nearby. A group of humans crouched in the grass would hear those vibrations long before they saw the herd, and the sound would become both a warning and a signal. It meant safety in one sense. Herbivores moving through might distract predators, but it also meant danger, because a single misstep could place people in the path of creatures too large to avoid. The sound of footsteps wasn't background noise, it was a constant reminder that the land was never empty. Then there were the calls. Dinosaurs didn't move silently. Hadrosaurs, with their hollow crests, produced deep, resonant sounds that could travel for miles. Those calls might echo across valleys, bouncing between cliffs, until they seemed to come from every direction at once. For humans, those calls would be unnerving. They would mark the presence of giants even when the animals themselves were out of sight. Night after night, the air would carry these low, booming sounds, blending with the crackle of fire and the whispers of people huddled close. Over time, humans would learn to read those calls, distinguishing between a warning, a mating display, or a simple contact call. Survival meant listening, and listening meant understanding what each sound signaled. Predators added sharper notes to this symphony. A tyrannosaur's roar would be unlike anything else. Low, guttural, filled with power. To hear it in the distance would freeze blood instantly, because the sound didn't just carry meaning, it carried dominance. Raptors, by contrast, might scream or bark in high-pitched tones, short and sharp, designed to coordinate hunts. The rustle of their movement in the grass might be subtle, but the sudden chorus of their calls could mean an attack was seconds away. Humans listening at the edge of firelight would learn to recognize these cues and respond quickly, shouting, raising spears, feeding the flames higher. The sounds of predators weren't only warnings, they were tests, forcing people to react in time or pay the price. Beyond the animals, the environment itself created sound. Forests filled with ferns rustled constantly, the leaves brushing against one another in the wind. Insects buzzed in swarms, louder than any modern equivalent. Rivers rushed faster because they had not yet been dammed or diverted. carrying logs and debris downstream with constant crashes. Thunderstorms swept across plains with sudden violence, the rain striking leaves as big as umbrellas, each drop echoing like a drumbeat. To humans, the environment was not silent space. It was a living, breathing presence, filled with layers of sound that could either calm or terrify depending on context. The sounds of that world would shape memory as much as vision. A child lying beside the fire would fall asleep to the deep rumble of distant herds, the chirps and shrieks of smaller creatures, and the constant low hiss of insects in the dark. Adults might wake suddenly to the crack of trees falling, signalling giants feeding nearby. A predator's roar would never be forgotten, carried in stories for generations as the sound of death itself. Over time, these sounds would become cultural markers, built into myths, rituals, and warnings. Words might even form around them, unique names for specific calls, so that people could communicate quickly about what they had heard. Silence would be rare, and therefore frightening. When the night grew too still, where no insects buzzed and no calls echoed, it might mean predators were close. Humans would learn that silence was not peace but danger. A quiet forest meant something had disturbed the balance, and that something was often a hunter waiting unseen. The soundscape of that world wasn't constant noise, it was constant information, and people learned to interpret every shift as a signal. The way humans use sound themselves would also change. Whispering around campfires might be necessary to avoid drawing predators closer. Singing or chanting might serve as both communication and defense. Loud voices carrying through the night to convince hunters that people were larger and more dangerous than they seemed. Drumming on logs, clapping stones together, or shouting in unison could create noise that frightened predators away. Sound became not only something to hear but something to produce deliberately, a tool of survival alongside fire and stone. Children would be trained to listen before they could even speak clearly. Parents would hush them when herds passed, teaching silence as a survival skill. Games might involve mimicking the calls of dinosaurs, not for fun but for practice, so that children grew up recognizing each sound and responding correctly. Entire generations would develop ears sharper than ours, capable of distinguishing subtle variations in calls, footsteps, and environmental noise. These sounds of that world shaped not only culture but biology, pressing humans to become listeners as much as thinkers. Over time, familiarity would not erase awe. Even after hearing them countless times, the deep calls of hadrosaurs or the roars of predators would still stir fear. The ground shaking beneath footsteps would still remind people of their fragility. And yet, those same sounds might also inspire wonder. A group resting under the stars might pause, listening to the chorus of creatures around them, realizing that they were part of something vast and ancient. The soundscape wasn't only danger, it was also beauty, strange and haunting, unlike anything in our own time. Think of a specific night. The fire burns low, insects hum loudly, and a soft wind rustles through the ferns. Then, far in the distance, a low resonant call rises, deep and mournful, echoing across the valley. The humans at the fire pause, listening, recognizing the call of hadrosaurs. It carries no immediate danger, but it fills the night with presence. Minutes later, another sound joins it. A roar, sharp and guttural, rolling through the darkness like thunder. The fire is fed, voices grow tense, and everyone listens. These sounds tell them everything they need to know. Giants are moving, predators are near, the night is alive. In that moment, sound itself is survival. The sounds of that world weren't background. They were the main thread of existence. They told people where to go, when to hide, when to fight, when to rest. They created culture, memory, and identity. For humans, survival wasn't just about what they saw or touched. It was about what they heard and what those sounds meant. Living in a world with dinosaurs meant living inside a constant storm of noise, one that shaped every decision, every story, and every breath. Every culture creates stories to explain the world, to make sense of dangers and wonders too vast to understand directly. In our world, humans told tales of thunderbirds, dragons, and giant serpents, beings larger than life that reflected both fear and fascination. Those myths arose even without real giants walking beside us. Now imagine a world where people actually lived among dinosaurs. The myths that might have been in such a reality would not be vague imaginings, but direct reflections of daily encounters. The stories told at night would grow from real sounds, real movements, real shadows towering over the firelight. They would not be distant symbols. They would be attempts to explain neighbours too massive to ignore. The simplest myths would have started with observation. A child asking why the ground shakes when the herd passes might be told that the earth itself carries the weight of sleeping giants beneath it, waking each time the sauropods move. The echoing calls of hadrosaurs would not be just noise, but voices of spirits calling across valleys, messages too deep for humans to understand. The roar of a predator might become the voice of angered gods, punishing those who stepped in the wrong place. Sound, movement, and scale would naturally be given meaning, transformed into explanations that bridge the gap between experience and understanding. Over time, those explanations would grow into legends. A group that survived a night when a sauropod walked directly through their camp without harming anyone might tell the story as proof of protection, a guardian beast watching over them. Another group that lost members to predators might describe those creatures not as animals, but as cursed beings sent to test their courage. Each event, retold across generations, would accumulate layers of meaning, becoming myths that shaped how people saw themselves. The myths wouldn't need exaggeration. The truth itself would be incredible enough. Symbols would naturally arise from encounters. Horned dinosaurs like Triceratops might become emblems of strength and defense, their image carved into stone as protectors. Predators with sharp teeth might symbolize death or punishment, appearing in cautionary tales to warn children of disobedience. Flying reptiles, soaring overhead with wings wider than any bird, could become messengers of the sky, carrying news between worlds. Humans surrounded by such creatures would not invent the concept of giants. They would live it, and their myths would preserve that reality in symbolic form. Fire, too, would take on new meaning in these stories. In our history, fire became sacred as a gift, a tool that separated humans from animals. In a world of dinosaurs, fire might be remembered as the weapon that kept predators at bay, the light that even the fiercest teeth hesitated to cross. Myths might describe fire as a gift stolen from the giants, taken by clever humans to survive in a world not meant for them. That act of theft could become a central story, repeated at every gathering, linking fire with defiance and resilience. Some myths would connect humans directly to dinosaurs, imagining kinship or ancestry. A child might be told that people were born from the eggs of giants, but too small, too fragile, and cast out to live separately. Others might say humans were the shadows of dinosaurs, reflections that learned to walk on their own. In those stories, being small wasn't shameful. It was destiny, a different role in the shared world. Myth provided a way to transform vulnerability into meaning, to make sense of living beside neighbours so much larger. Conflicts with predators would become moral lessons. A tale of a raptor stealing a child might evolve into a warning about wandering too far from camp. A story of a tyrannosaur attacking a hunter might become a parable about pride, showing that even the bravest could fall if they forgot their limits. Myths were not just entertainment. They were survival guides wrapped in memory, ways to ensure that children remembered rules long after direct danger had passed. The presence of dinosaurs gave those lessons weight. To ignore a myth meant risking real death. Over time, humans might start to assign personalities to different species. Sauropods could be seen as peaceful giants, slow and patient, teachers of endurance. Raptors could be tricksters, clever and dangerous, embodying both intelligence and deceit. Horned dinosaurs could represent protectors, fierce but honourable, fighting only when threatened. Flying reptiles could symbolise freedom, untethered by the ground, embodying dreams of escape. Each animal that humans encountered daily would find its place in a larger symbolic system, shaping not only stories but rituals, art and belief. Imagine the rituals themselves. A group preparing to migrate might chant to the herds, asking them to move slowly so the people could pass safely. Hunters might leave offerings of bones or meet near a predator's territory, hoping to appease it. Fires might be lit in patterns, not just for safety, but as signals to the spirits of the giants, asking for protection through the night. Myths were not separate from daily life. They were woven into it, guiding actions as much as explaining them. Art would carry these myths forward. Carvings in wood or stone could show humans standing beneath towering figures, emphasizing the scale that defined existence. Patterns might mimic the calls of hadrosaurs, carved into drums or whistles to summon memory. Paint on cave walls might show wings stretched wide, teeth bared, tails lashing, images drawn not from imagination alone, but from reality witnessed daily. The art itself would be myth in visual form, preserving encounters so they could be retold across generations. Children would grow up steeped in these stories, learning their place in the world through tales of giants and predators. Instead of hearing about imaginary dragons, they would hear about the horned beast that saved a camp, the flying shadow that carried news across valleys, or the predator that punished arrogance. These stories would shape identity, teaching children not to see themselves as masters of the land but as small participants in a larger system. The myths that might have been would make humility a central value, reminding people constantly that survival depended on respect for forces larger than themselves. The myths would also provide comfort. In a world filled with danger, stories gave meaning to loss. If a hunter was killed by a predator, his death might be described not as meaningless tragedy, but as a chosen test, a trial of courage demanded by the giants. If a child disappeared, parents might console themselves with the belief that the spirits of the dinosaurs had taken the child into their care. Myths softened the harshness of reality, turning chaos into order, tragedy into narrative. Without them, survival might have felt unbearable. But myths were not only about fear and death. They also celebrated wonder. People would tell stories of seeing herds silhouetted against the sunrise, of hearing calls echo through valleys like music, of watching flying reptiles drift across the sky like drifting clouds. Those stories might imagine the giants as companions, as reminders of beauty, as proof that the world was vast and mysterious. Myths would balance fear with awe, survival with appreciation. They would preserve not only the threats of dinosaurs but their majesty. Imagine one story in detail. A child asks why humans are so small compared to their neighbours. The elder smiles and begins to tell the tale of the first fire. Long ago the giants ruled completely. Humans were nothing but shadows on the ground, unnoticed, forgotten. One day, a shadow learned to catch a spark fallen from the sky. That spark grew into fire, and fire gave the shadows warmth, protection, and courage. The giants, seeing this, allowed the shadows to walk among them, small but not powerless. From then on, humans were not just shadows, they were keepers of fire, partners of the giants. The tale explains both smallness and resilience, turning vulnerability into purpose. Myths like this would grow naturally in such a world, weaving real experiences with meaning. Over generations, entire cosmologies could develop. The Earth might be seen as the body of a giant dinosaur, its footsteps shaping valleys, its breath creating wind. The stars might be imagined as the eyes of predators watching from above, always present, always aware. The cycles of migration might be tied to the turning of seasons, explained as the journeys of divine herds across the sky. Humans would not separate themselves from the giants in these stories. They would place themselves within the same framework, connected by shared space and shared survival. In the end, the myths that might have been reveal as much about humanity as about dinosaurs. People always seek meaning, always create stories that explain what they cannot control. Living among dinosaurs would not have erased that instinct, it would have intensified it. The giants gave the world shape, and humans would give that shape meaning through myth. Fear, wonder, tragedy, and hope would all be preserved in stories told by firelight, carried forward long after the actual events had passed. The myths would not just explain the world, they would help people live in it. Night has always been the most dangerous time for humans. Our eyes are not designed for darkness, our ears are sharp but not enough to detect every threat, and our bodies are slower than predators that use the night as their hunting ground. In our own history, fire turned that imbalance into a fragile advantage. It created light, warmth, and protection where none existed. In a world where humans shared the earth with dinosaurs, the fire and the night would have been the stage where survival played out every single day. Picture the moment when the last of the daylight fades. The orange glow slips below the horizon, leaving forests and plains wrapped in shadow. For a brief time, twilight softens the edges of everything, and then it is gone. The night is immediate, heavy, filled with sounds that never stop. Insects buzz louder than thought. Distant calls echo through valleys, booming and low from herbivores, sharper from predators. Somewhere far off, trees crack and topple under the weight of giants moving unseen. The humans gather close to their fire, knowing that the small circle of light is the only thing standing between them and the vast dark. The fire becomes more than heat. It is a boundary, a marker between two worlds. Inside its glow, people can see one another's faces, the flicker of shadows, the movements of children settling against their parents. Outside it lies everything unknown. Predators circle at the edge of the light, their eyes reflecting orange when they glance too close. Herbivores might wander near, indifferent to the flames, their massive legs casting shadows as they pass. To sit by the fire at night is to live in a fragile balance, safe for now, but always aware that the dark holds more than can be seen. The night forces humans to pay attention. Every sound matters. A twig snapping could mean nothing, or it could mean raptors moving closer. A sudden silence among insects might mean a predator has entered the area. The wind shifting could bring the scent of something dangerous. Around the fire, people sit not only for warmth, but to listen, to share vigilance, to be ready when the dark presses too close. Sleep comes in fragments, with some always awake, feeding the flames, scanning the shadows. The night is not rest. It is constant negotiation with fear, and yet the fire offers something beyond defense. It draws people together. In the day, groups may scatter to gather food, hunt, or explore, but at night they always return. The fire is the center, the anchor that gathers everyone into one place. It is where food is shared, where stories are told, where songs are sung to distract from fear. Children fall asleep to the rhythm of voices, to the crackle of flames, to the warmth of bodies pressed close. The fire turns the night into community, making survival not only possible but bearable. The predators know this as well. They linger at the edge, drawn by the smell of meat cooking, by the sight of movement. Sometimes they test the boundary, stepping closer, growling, waiting for a chance. Humans respond with noise, with sparks thrown outward, with spears raised high. Most nights, the predators keep their distance, wary of the flames. Some nights hunger drives them forward anyway, and the fire becomes the last defense between survival and disaster. Those moments become stories retold endlessly. The night when a predator lunged from the shadows, the night when fire drove it back, the night when someone didn't survive. The fire and the night are inseparable in memory, linked as danger and salvation at once. The giants that pass through the darkness add another layer. A herd of sauropods moving nearby might sound like a storm, the ground trembling, the air filled with low groans. To humans by the fire, the experience is overwhelming. They cannot fight, cannot stop the herd, can only wait and hope the giants pass without crushing them. In such moments the fire feels small, its glow lost against the bulk of creatures that don't even notice it exists. Yet even then the fire is held tightly, fed carefully, protected above all else. Because no matter how large the danger, losing the fire would mean losing everything. The fire is fragile. A sudden rain could put it out. A careless hand could scatter it. A predator attack could separate people from it. For this reason, fire is guarded like life itself. Embers are carried from one camp to the next, wrapped in leaves or bark, glowing softly through the night. Children are taught from the start that fire must never be abandoned. The rituals around tending it become central to culture. Someone always watches, someone always feeds it, someone always ensures it never dies. The fire is not a tool. It is a companion, a constant presence in a world where so little else can be controlled. At night, myths take shape around it. People tell stories of how fire was stolen from the giants, how it was gifted by the spirits, how it carries voices from the sky. The flames themselves become symbolic, representing safety, hope, and endurance. To sit by the fire at night is not only to survive but to participate in tradition. The stories told in that circle carry meaning for generations, teaching lessons, preserving warnings, creating identity. The fire and the night are not separate. They form the backdrop of human imagination itself. Even practical tasks are transformed by the night. Food must be cooked quickly because the smell draws predators. Ashes are sometimes spread around the camp to mask human scent. Flames are kept high enough to deter but low enough to conserve fuel. Everything is balanced carefully, each decision weighed against the risks outside the circle. The fire and the night demand constant judgment, constant adaptation. A mistake means not just discomfort, but death. Children feel this most intensely. By day they may play, explore, or chase one another in safety. By night they are hushed, drawn close, taught silence and caution. The lessons of survival begin here. Don't step beyond the firelight, don't wander into shadows, don't ignore the sounds of the night. The fire is their first teacher, the night their first warning. Together they shape children into adults who understand the fragility of life in a world that never stops pressing in. Despite the danger, the night has beauty too. Imagine looking up from the fire to see stars stretching endlessly across the sky, framed by the silhouettes of giant necks moving slowly above. The sounds of insects, the calls of distant creatures, the crackle of flame. Together they create a symphony unlike anything in our world. The fear is real, but so is the wonder. People learn not only to dread the night, but to see it as a time of connection with each other, with the fire, with the world beyond the edges of light. The fire makes the night survivable, but it also makes it meaningful. Over generations, the rhythm of fire and night becomes the rhythm of life. Days are for action, nights for gathering. Fire is carried across valleys, across rivers, across generations. The night never stops being dangerous, but it never stops being endured. Humans persist not because they conquer the night, but because they learn to live within it, to make fire their shield, their comfort, their centre. In a world ruled by dinosaurs, this rhythm is even stronger. Without fire, the night would consume them. With fire, they carve out a fragile space of safety, enough to continue, enough to survive. And so the fire and the night remain the constant pair. One small, flickering, fragile, and human. The other vast, overwhelming, filled with predators and giants. Together they define existence, each shaping the other. Without night, fire would not matter. Without fire, night would be the end. For humans, life in this world is always lived in the glow of flames, with the dark pressing just beyond. And in that balance, fragile but enduring, humanity finds its way forward. Every encounter between humans and dinosaurs would raise the same question. Were people partners in the landscape or simply prey? The answer was never simple. Sometimes the relationship looked one way, sometimes the other, and often it shifted within the span of a single day. Living alongside giants meant living in constant uncertainty, always watching for signs that today's tolerance might become tomorrow's disaster. The tension between partnership and prey status shaped everything about how people behaved, how they thought, and how they saw themselves. Start with herbivores, the most common giants across plains and forests. Herds of sauropods grazed endlessly, consuming entire forests in their passage. Triceratops locked horns in loud battles for dominance, shaking the ground with each impact. Hadrosaurs called to one another with voices so deep they carried for miles. Humans moving near such animals couldn't hope to compete, but at the same time, those herds could create opportunities. When predators followed them, humans could scavenge from carcasses left behind. When herds opened clearings by stripping plants, sunlight reached the ground, making new growth accessible. People might even use the herds as shields, lingering on their edges where predators hesitated to strike. In those moments, herbivores became unknowing partners, creating chances for survival. Yet one wrong step, one stray movement into the path of the herd, and those same giants would crush humans without noticing. Partnership was never chosen. It was accidental, fragile, and temporary. Predators, on the other hand, were never neutral. They tested boundaries constantly. Raptors circled at the edge of firelight, gauging weaknesses. Tyrannosaurs roared across valleys, claiming territory without compromise. To them, humans were small animals, and small animals were potential prey. No matter how clever or careful people were, they couldn't erase that instinct. Yet even here, the story wasn't straightforward. Predators didn't waste energy unnecessarily. They hunted when the reward outweighed the risk. Humans with fire, noise, and spears could sometimes tip the calculation against themselves as targets. A predator might decide to move on, searching for easier meals. In that moment, the human group had shifted, not into true partners, but into creatures recognized enough to be left alone. Survival meant constantly walking that line, convincing predators that people were not worth the trouble, even if they could never fully stop being seen as food. Small dinosaurs complicated this further. Some were competitors for the same food sources, raiding nests for eggs, stripping plants that people also gathered. Others scavenged near human camps, drawn by scraps of food or discarded bones. Over time, humans might have tolerated these smaller creatures, just as they tolerated scavenging birds or wild dogs in our own past. The relationship wasn't warm, but it was functional. The creatures gained food and humans gained warnings, because the sudden flight or cries of scavengers often signaled larger predators nearby. These small interactions blurred the line between partnership and prey, creating a shared rhythm of coexistence. The possibility of real partnership raises difficult questions. Could humans have tamed or worked with dinosaurs the way they eventually did with dogs, horses, or cattle? The answer is uncertain. The intelligence of predators like raptors might have made cooperation possible, but their danger made it almost impossible to attempt. Herbivores were immense and unmanageable, far beyond the strength of early humans. Small dinosaurs, however, might have offered potential. If scavenging creatures lingered around camps long enough, some humans might have begun feeding them deliberately, encouraging familiarity. Over generations, a cautious relationship could emerge, not domestication in the modern sense, but tolerance. A recognition that neither side gained from hostility. Even this fragile arrangement would be remarkable, proof that humans could carve something resembling partnership from a world that often saw them only as prey. But for every possibility of cooperation, there was the constant threat of death. A child wandering from camp could vanish into the jaws of a predator. A herd shifting suddenly could trample a group without noticing. A raptor pack that had watched silently for days could strike in an instant. These losses would shape culture deeply. Myths and stories would not just celebrate giants as protectors or symbols, they would warn constantly of the reality that humans were prey. The balance of fear and fascination would define how people saw every creature around them. The question of partnership or prey also shaped migration. Humans couldn't move freely across the land. They followed paths carved by giants, timing their movements to avoid direct clashes. Sometimes they shadowed herds, scavenging opportunities. Other times they avoided herds entirely, knowing that predators followed close behind. Their choices weren't about preference. They were about interpreting whether a group of dinosaurs nearby represented a potential benefit or an immediate danger. Every step into a new valley, every decision to cross a river or climb a ridge, was a calculation of partnership or prey status. This constant calculation shaped how humans thought about themselves. In our world, people eventually came to see themselves as rulers of the land, bending nature to their will. In a world shared with dinosaurs, that perspective might never have formed. Instead, humans would define themselves as adapters, creatures who survived by reading the intentions of others, by learning when to lean close and when to retreat. Their identity wouldn't be about dominance, but about interpretation, about the ability to navigate a world that saw them as insignificant. The line between partnership and prey would become the lens through which they saw everything. The lessons of this balance would pass through generations. Parents would teach children to approach herds with caution, to recognize predator calls, to feed fire constantly, to scatter food scraps in ways that distracted scavengers. Stories around the fire would reinforce these lessons, turning them into cultural memory. Children would grow up knowing that their lives depended not just on bravery, but on judgment, on the ability to sense whether the creatures nearby could be allies, distractions, or killers. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about reading the shifting line between partnership and prey and acting accordingly. Imagine one specific evening. A group settles by a riverbank, building a fire, preparing to fish. As night falls, a herd of hadrosaurs approaches, their calls echoing in the dark. The humans wait, silent, watching. The herd drinks, strips plants from the bank, then moves on. The people breathe easier. The presence of the herd shielded them for a time, keeping predators at bay. That night, the herd was a partner. But later, as the fire burns low, eyes glint in the shadows. Raptors approach, drawn by the smell of fish. The people shout, wave torches, throw sparks. The predators test, circle, and then withdraw. The group survives, but the message is clear. They are always prey, no matter how clever, no matter how careful. The next night may not end the same way. Over centuries, this tension might create entire systems of belief. Some groups might emphasize partnership, seeing the giants as protectors, neighbors, even teachers. Others might emphasize the reality of predation, living in constant fear and framing survival as proof of endurance against endless threat. These differing perspectives could shape culture, rituals, and identity in distinct ways. But no group could ever escape the basic truth. In a world of dinosaurs, humans were always walking the line between cooperation and consumption. Even in tragedy, meaning would be sought. When someone was lost to predators, the story might be told as a sacrifice, a lesson, or a reminder of limits. When a herd passed harmlessly by, it might be remembered as a blessing. The myths and traditions that grew from these events would preserve not only the fear, but also the resilience of people who refused to give up, even when surrounded by creatures far larger, stronger, and more numerous than themselves. The balance between partnership and prey never resolved fully. It shifted constantly, day to day, hour to hour, depending on hunger, movement, and chance. Humans survived not because they tipped the balance permanently in their favour, but because they learned to live within its uncertainty. They endured by accepting that sometimes they were tolerated, sometimes they were threatened, and always they were small. The fire, the tools, the stories, and the communities they built all existed to help them navigate that shifting line. And as fragile as it was, it worked. They survived in landscapes that should have erased them. In our own history, the age of dinosaurs ended long before humans arrived. An asteroid struck, climates shifted, ecosystems collapsed, and the great reptiles that once ruled the Earth vanished. Mammals filled the gap, evolving into forms that eventually produced us. But imagine a world where that extinction never finished, or where humans appeared before it happened. Extinction interrupted would mean living not in the aftermath of giants, but alongside them, trapped in a history that refused to move forward as it truly did. The presence of dinosaurs in human time changes every assumption about what evolution means. Instead of inheriting a planet left open by the fall of giants, humans would carve out existence in a world already crowded, already dominated by creatures that left little space. Mammoths and lions shaped our ancestors in one way. Sauropods and tyrannosaurs would shape them in another. Every decision about food, shelter, and movement would be dictated by creatures that should have been long gone. Humans would never be heirs. They would be survivors of an interrupted process, forever sharing the stage with actors that history had not removed. The struggle for resources would have been sharper. Dinosaurs consumed on scales that dwarfed mammals. A herd of sauropods could strip an entire valley bare, leaving nothing for smaller animals. Carnivores competed directly with humans for prey, making hunting dangerous and often futile. In such a world, people would turn more and more to what the giants ignored: roots, insects, fish, and whatever small animals managed to endure in the shadows of dinosaurs. Human diets might be less about hunting large game and more about scavenging opportunities. Extinction interrupted meant never inheriting abundance, always living in scarcity shaped by the appetites of giants. The danger was constant, but so was the possibility of adaptation. Humans are specialists in finding ways forward when others cannot. They might have built traps not for giants, but for the smaller creatures that slipped through gaps in the food chain. They might have mastered fishing, learning to pull resources from rivers and coasts ignored by most dinosaurs. They might even have turned to cooperation with scavengers, following their movements to locate opportunities. Survival in an interrupted world required relentless creativity. Every strategy had to shift around the fact that the old rulers were still present, still consuming, still setting the terms of existence. Extinction interrupted also meant that humans would never see themselves as inevitable. In our timeline, looking back, we imagine human dominance as a natural outcome, the product of intelligence and persistence. In a world where dinosaurs endured, that confidence might never develop. People would see themselves as fragile, as temporary, as one species among many rather than the destined rulers of the earth. Their myths would reflect that awareness, framing humans not as chosen but as tolerated, living in the cracks of history rather than atop it. That humility might prevent arrogance, but it would also make survival feel uncertain, always contingent on forces beyond control. The constant presence of giants might also shape how humans understood time. Extinction marks clear breaks in history, before and after, then and now. Without that break, the world would feel continuous, unchanging, filled with creatures that had ruled for millions of years. Humans, appearing late in this timeline, would feel like newcomers in a story already told. The sense of being out of place, too small and too recent, might shape identity deeply. People would tell stories of arriving too soon, of living in a world that wasn't yet ready for them. The idea of destiny would be replaced with the idea of persistence, of enduring in a history that had refused to move forward. The very landscapes would reflect this. Plains trampled by herds, forests stripped bare, riverbanks crowded with predators. The land would bear marks of creatures that had survived longer than humans could comprehend. Every valley would carry evidence of their dominance, every horizon filled with silhouettes of forms that should have been fossils. To walk through such a world would be to walk through prehistory made present, a museum alive and dangerous. Extinction interrupted didn't mean stasis. It meant daily encounters with the past, made real in the most immediate and threatening ways. Children growing up in such a world would never think of dinosaurs as ancient. They would think of them as ordinary, as neighbours, as constant presences. The concept of extinction itself might never form. Death, yes. Loss, yes. But the idea that entire species could vanish forever might feel impossible in a world where giants endured without end. That sense of permanence could shape imagination in profound ways. The giants were eternal, humans were temporary. That imbalance framed every thought about the future. And yet, extinction interrupted didn't mean humans had no chance. If anything, the pressure of living with dinosaurs might accelerate certain changes. Intelligence might sharpen faster, because cleverness was the only defense against overwhelming size. Cooperation might deepen, because isolation was suicide. Tools might develop more quickly, because bare hands meant nothing against claws and teeth. In a strange way, the survival of dinosaurs might push humans to evolve faster, forcing them to find strategies that would not have been necessary in a world left open by extinction. The giants didn't only threaten, they challenged, and challenges often fuel growth. Imagine a specific scene. A group of humans follows a herd of hadrosaurs across a plain, scavenging scraps of plants torn free by the giants. At night they light fires knowing predators circle nearby. In the morning, they move again, always in the shadow of larger creatures, always aware that their lives depend on predicting the movements of animals that don't even notice them. To those humans, survival isn't about dominance, it's about enduring within a story that began long before them and shows no sign of ending. Extinction hasn't cleared the stage. It has left them improvising in the margins, hoping to find enough space to live. The emotional weight of this cannot be ignored. To live every day in the presence of creatures that seem eternal is to feel small, fragile, and impermanent. But it is also to feel awe. The sight of a sauropod moving across the horizon, the sound of a predator's roar shaking the air, the rush of a herd flooding through a valley. These experiences would shape not only fear but also wonder. People would tell stories not just of survival, but of majesty, of the beauty of giants that endured against all odds. Extinction Interrupted was not only threat, it was also a constant reminder of the extraordinary of a world larger than human life alone. Over centuries, this tension would define human identity. They were not rulers. They were survivors of an interrupted process, a species living in a history that never finished unfolding. Their resilience, their cleverness, their persistence all came from adapting to a world where giants never fell. The very fact that they endured at all would be remarkable. Extinction Interrupted didn't erase humanity. It shaped it, sharpening its edges, forcing it to find meaning in persistence rather than power. And perhaps that was enough. Survival in such a world was victory in itself. Movement has always been part of human life. Our ancestors rarely stayed in one place for long, following herds, seasons and resources across vast distances. In our world, those migrations shaped language, culture, and even the spread of humanity itself. But in a world where dinosaurs still roamed, migration would take on an entirely new scale. The Great Migration would not only involve people moving across the land, but doing so in the shadow of creatures that dwarfed them in number, size, and power. To migrate in such a world was not simply to travel. It was to survive by weaving human paths into the larger movements of giants. Herds of dinosaurs did not wander randomly. They followed food, water, and the rhythms of climate, often moving in groups so large they reshaped entire landscapes. Sauropods could march across plains in endless lines, stripping trees, trampling soil, and leaving barren ground behind them. Hadrosaurs might gather in numbers that seemed to fill the horizon. their calls echoing for miles as they coordinated movement. Raptors, tyrannosaurs, and other predators followed close, shadowing these herds and waiting for weakness. For humans, the migration of dinosaurs was both danger and opportunity. Following too close could mean being caught in the chaos of predators. Staying too far behind could mean finding only stripped, lifeless land. The Great Migration demanded constant calculation, every step weighed against risk and reward. Imagine a human group setting out at dawn, carrying fire, tools, and children on their backs. They move along the edges of a sauropod herd, close enough to find food in the clearings left behind, but far enough to avoid being crushed. The sound of giants walking fills the air, a low thunder that never stops. Dust rises with every step, clinging to skin and hair. The humans press forward, not because they choose to, but because the herd itself demands movement. To pause would mean losing track of food, losing track of safety. The giants set the pace, and humans adapt to it, their own migration tied to that of creatures that never notice them. Water is often the destination. Rivers and lakes draw both humans and dinosaurs, creating points of convergence where opportunities and dangers collide. A herd reaching water might crowd the banks until there is no space left for smaller creatures. Humans arriving at the same place must wait, crouched in cover, until the giants finish. Only then can they approach, drink quickly, and refill their vessels before predators sweep in. The migration always leads back to water, but water never guarantees safety. Each stop becomes a test of timing, and timing means the difference between life and death. Seasons also shape the rhythm of movement. Dry months push herds across greater distances, scattering humans along uncertain paths. Wet months flood valleys, creating swamps that giants cross easily, but that people struggle to navigate. Migration means adapting constantly, never relying on permanence. Shelters built one week are abandoned the next. Fires lit in one valley are replaced by fires in another. Children learn early that nothing lasts long in this world. Not camps, not hunting grounds, not even paths. The only constant is motion, the endless cycle of leaving one place for another. Predators transform migration into an even harsher test. Following herds means walking into the same territories claimed by hunters. Raptors lurk in tall grass, tyrannosaurs stalk from ridges, and smaller carnivores prowl riverbanks. Humans cannot outrun them, cannot outfight them. Their only defense is to move together, to stay alert, to use fire and noise to create hesitation. At night, migration pauses, but danger does not. Fires burn brighter, guards watch longer, and every rustle in the dark is measured against the need to survive until morning. Migration is not a march. It is a gauntlet, with threats on every side. Despite this, migration also provides possibilities. The trails of giants carve paths through forests, making movement easier for humans. The clearings left behind after herds feed open space for smaller plants that people can gather. Carcasses abandoned by predators offer food and tools, if scavenged quickly and carefully. Migration is not just endurance, it is adaptation, using the giants' movements to find opportunity in what they leave behind. The very scale of dinosaur migration creates a kind of order in the land, one that humans can exploit if they are clever enough. Children experience migration differently than adults. For them, the movement is endless, a childhood spent watching the backs of adults as they walk, hearing the rumble of herds, falling asleep under new skies every few days. They learn to walk quickly, to carry loads, to stay silent when predators are near. Games may involve imitating the calls of dinosaurs, not only for fun but for practice, learning the difference between harmless sounds and dangerous ones. Childhood in migration is short, because survival requires maturity early. By the time they're barely grown, children know the rhythms of movement as well as their parents, carrying them into the next cycle of migration. The Great Migration also shapes culture. Stories told at night often describe past journeys, valleys crossed, predators escaped, herds encountered. Songs help coordinate walking, keeping spirits steady across long distances. Rituals mark the start and end of migrations, offering thanks to the fire that survived the journey or to the water that sustained them along the way. Myths may describe humans as eternal wanderers, destined to follow the footsteps of giants, never rooted, always moving. Migration becomes more than survival. It becomes identity, the definition of what it means to be human in a world of dinosaurs. Imagine one long journey in detail. A group begins in a forest thick with cycads, moving outward as food runs low. They follow the sound of a hadrosaur herd, using the giant's calls as markers of direction. Days stretch into weeks. Dust and hunger weigh heavily, but fire never dies, carried carefully from one camp to the next. At last they reach a river, only to find the banks crowded with predators feeding on carcasses. The humans wait, hidden until the feeding frenzy subsides. Then they step forward, drink quickly, and gather what they can. Already the herd is moving again, and the humans have no choice but to follow. This is migration. Not choice, not freedom, but necessity, written into every step of their lives. Over centuries, the Great Migration would leave traces, trails worn by countless footsteps, campsites layered with ashes, stories carried from one group to another. Humans would never settle permanently, but they would leave behind patterns of movement recognizable to future generations. The land itself would remember them, etched with the paths of wanderers who learned to survive by following the rhythms of giants. In a world where extinction never cleared the stage, migration was not just survival, it was the only way of life possible. The Great Migration reveals both fragility and resilience. Humans were small, slow, and vulnerable, always at risk of being prey, always overshadowed by creatures too vast to challenge. Yet they endured by moving, by adapting, by finding opportunity in the wake of giants. Extinction interrupted meant never inheriting the earth, but migration meant carving out a place anyway. Each step forward, each fire lit, each river crossed was proof that humans could survive in motion, even when the world itself seemed too large for them. And so the migration never ended. It carried humans across plains, through forests, along rivers, always chasing survival, always shadowing the footsteps of giants. The Great Migration was not a journey with a destination. It was the way of existence itself, the rhythm of life in a world that belonged to others. To endure in such a world meant to keep walking, no matter how far, no matter how dangerous, no matter how uncertain. The fire moved with them. The stories moved with them. The people moved with them. And in that endless motion, they found a way to remain. Evolution is shaped by pressure. In our own history, the disappearance of dinosaurs gave mammals the chance to expand, filling niches left empty by extinction. From those mammals came primates, from primates came humans, and from humans came the civilizations we know. But in a world where dinosaurs never left, where extinction was interrupted and humans had to live among them, evolution would have followed a different path. Every trait, every adaptation, every cultural habit would reflect the need to survive in a world where giants remained the dominant presence. The most obvious pressure would come from size. Humans were small compared to dinosaurs, too fragile to fight and too slow to flee. That fragility would demand sharper senses. Perhaps eyesight would grow keener, better at detecting movement in tall grass. Hearing might refine further, able to distinguish the distant thunder of footsteps from the closer rustle of predators. Smell could even become more important, detecting the scent of danger before it arrived. Each sense would be pushed to its limits by the need to recognize threat earlier, because 1 second too late meant extinction on an individual level. A different evolution would not change size. It would change awareness. Brains would evolve under similar pressure. Intelligence was already humanity's advantage, but in a world of dinosaurs, cleverness would have to sharpen even faster. Survival would depend on pattern recognition, on remembering the habits of herds, on predicting predator behaviour. A child who could recognise calls early might save their family. A hunter who learned the rhythm of a herd might lead their group to food. Memory and foresight would be prized, passed down through generations, selecting for sharper minds and better cooperation. The giants outside the firelight were not only threats, they were teachers, forcing humanity to think harder, plan better, and adapt more quickly. Bodies might change in subtler ways. Agility would matter more than strength. Climbing ability might increase, allowing humans to escape into trees when predators approached. Endurance would still matter, as migration required walking long distances, but bursts of speed to reach cover could be equally vital. Over thousands of years, these pressures might produce humans leaner, faster, and more flexible than the ones we know, built less for confrontation and more for evasion. The giants rewarded those who could slip away, not those who stood and fought. Culture itself would be part of evolution. Skills and traditions acted as survival tools as much as physical traits. In our world, toolmaking grew steadily, shaping humanity's future. In a world of dinosaurs, the pace of toolmaking might accelerate. Spears would be sharpened sooner, fires tended more carefully, shelters built with greater care. Innovation would not be optional, it would be mandatory. Groups that failed to adapt their tools would vanish, leaving behind only those who advance quickly. Culture and evolution would merge, pushing humanity forward in ways that simple biology could not achieve alone. Communication might evolve differently as well. In our world, language grew to coordinate hunts, share stories, and build social bonds. In a dinosaur world, language might develop even earlier, driven by the need to warn, to coordinate against predators, to share knowledge of herds and migrations. Words for different calls, for specific dangers, for safe paths through valleys would become essential. A group without strong communication could not survive. Over time, this pressure might make language more complex, stories more detailed, memory more precise. A different evolution would not only shape bodies, it would shape voices, sharpening them into tools as vital as spears or fire. Fear itself could shape evolution. Living constantly on the edge of danger would make anxiety a survival trait. People who startled easily, who remained alert in silence, who woke quickly at the snap of a twig would pass on their vigilance. Over generations, this could create humans more attuned to stress, more reactive to potential threats. The downside would be exhaustion, the constant weight of fear pressing down, but those who learned to balance vigilance with resilience would endure. Evolution favoured not only the strong or the clever, but the cautious, the ones who treated every shadow as a possibility. The presence of dinosaurs might also shape human cooperation differently. In our world, humans eventually competed with one another as much as with the environment. In a world dominated by giants, cooperation would remain central for far longer. A lone group could not withstand predators. Only together, in larger networks, could people survive. Over time, this might create societies less prone to fragmentation, more focused on collective endurance. Conflict would not vanish, but the constant pressure of external danger might keep groups aligned, always reminded that survival depended on unity. The myths of such a world would feed back into evolution too. Stories taught children lessons, shaping behaviour before direct experience did. If myths emphasised humility, children grew cautious. If they emphasised cleverness, children grew inventive. Over centuries, these values selected for traits that matched them, intertwining culture with biology. Evolution wasn't only about bodies, it was about minds, beliefs, and habits shaped by the presence of giants that loomed over every decision. Technology would follow a different arc. Domestication of large animals might never occur because no dinosaur was manageable in that way. Instead, humans might focus earlier on controlling environments, building barriers, digging pits, shaping landscapes to create safety. Fire would remain central, but other tools might develop sooner. Perhaps bolus or nets would be invented earlier, designed to capture smaller prey while avoiding giants. Perhaps shelters would grow more complex, built into cliffs or caves, turning natural features into defences. Innovation would cluster around survival against creatures too large to control, making human technology less about domination and more about clever evasion. Even reproduction might shift. In a world so dangerous, groups that reproduced earlier or more frequently would pass on more descendants. Childhood might shorten, with children taking on responsibilities at younger ages. Lifespans might still reach decades, but the emphasis would be on survival long enough to reproduce, not on extended old age. Elders who survived would still matter deeply, as keepers of memory and stories, but the pace of life might feel faster, more urgent, shaped by the constant risk of sudden death. Evolution under these pressures would produce humans who lived with urgency, always aware that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Imagine one group in detail. They are leaner than us, their movements quick and cautious. Their eyesight is sharp, able to pick out the ripple of grass when something moves. Their hearing is tuned to the low rumble of herds and the high calls of predators. They carry fire wherever they go, guarded like treasure, never allowed to die. Their language is filled with specific words for danger, the call of a hadrosaur, the roar of a predator, the silence that means threat is near. Children grow into adults by 10 or 12 years old, already carrying spears, already taking part in the watch. Their lives are short, but they are skilled, adaptable, and resilient. They are humans shaped not by absence of giants, but by their constant presence. The difference would be profound. Our history led to agriculture, settlement, and eventually civilization because space opened after extinction. In a world where dinosaurs remained, that space never opened. Agriculture might emerge only in the narrowest of places, sheltered valleys where herds couldn't reach. Settlements might remain temporary, because giants could destroy them at any time. Civilization as we know it might be delayed for millennia, or perhaps never arrive at all. A different evolution would mean a different human story, not of dominance, but of persistence, of surviving as one small piece in a world that never stopped belonging to others. And yet, within that persistence lies meaning. Humans would still invent, still imagine, still tell stories and raise children and light fires. Their lives would still matter, even if they were never rulers. Evolution doesn't always lead to power. Sometimes it leads to endurance, to the ability to remain in places where survival seems impossible. In a world of dinosaurs, that endurance would be humanity's greatest legacy. Civilization as we know it was built on the foundation of agriculture, settlement, and the ability to bend the environment into something predictable. Fields were cleared, animals were domesticated, rivers were managed, and stone was cut into monuments and homes. All of that required space free from constant threat, space where people could settle long enough to pass knowledge from one generation to the next without being forced to abandon it. In a world where dinosaurs still roamed, civilization would not be built on open land or in wide valleys. It would be shaped by the giants that overshadowed every horizon. Civilizations of stone and scale would grow, not in defiance of the dinosaurs, but in negotiation with them. The first change would be location. Instead of fertile plains, people might seek cliffs, caves, and rocky outcrops. Stone offered protection that wood and grass could not. Shelters carved into rock could withstand the accidental passage of a herd or the deliberate attack of predators. High ground gave sightlines to spot danger early, while narrow paths made it harder for giants to approach. The very image of settlement might look different. Not open villages scattered across the land, but clusters of stone dwellings clinging to cliffs, glowing faintly with firelight at night while the plains below shook with the footsteps of sauropods. Civilization here was not about claiming space, but about hiding within it, building permanence in the few places giants could not reach. Agriculture would face the greatest challenge. In our world, fields stretched openly, tended season after season. But in a dinosaur world, no field left unguarded could survive. A herd passing by would strip it bare in a single day. Predators drawn to grazing animals would trample or destroy anything in their path. To grow crops, humans would need protection. They might terrace cliff sides, planting in narrow strips safe from herds. They might dig into caves, experimenting with underground growth where predators could not enter. Agriculture would develop slowly, always shaped by the need to defend it. The vision of endless fields might never exist. Instead, food would grow in hidden patches, carefully guarded, every harvest a fragile victory against giants that consumed the world without noticing. Stone itself would become sacred. In our history, stone was used for monuments, walls, and tools. In this world, it would be the material of survival. Stone walls kept predators out. Stone towers offered watch points to see herds moving in the distance. Stone tools became sharper, stronger, more carefully crafted, because failure against a predator meant death. Civilizations of stone would not only build with it, they would worship it, seeing it as the only element that endured against scale and claw. Fire gave light and warmth, but stone gave permanence. Together they defined safety in a world where little else was stable. Scale, the constant presence of giants, would shape every cultural practice. Religion might focus on them, seeing sauropods as living mountains, triceratops as protectors, predators as forces of judgment. Art would depict them endlessly, painted on stone walls, carved into tools, woven into songs. Children would grow up learning not only about fire and stone, but about the giants themselves, their habits, their calls, their dangers. Knowledge of dinosaurs was not separate from daily life. It was daily life, woven into the core of civilization itself. Trade might even grow from the rhythms of dinosaurs. One group living near cliffs could exchange stone tools with another living near rivers rich with fish. Migration paths of herds might mark seasonal markets, where groups gathered to trade before moving again. Information about herd movements, predator territories, and safe routes would be as valuable as food or tools. Civilization in this world wasn't built only on objects. It was built on knowledge, the shared memory of how to survive among giants. Rituals would reflect this precarious balance. Before planting, offerings might be left at the edges of cliffs, asking the giants not to approach. Before migration, fires might be lit in patterns, signalling respect or warning to the creatures nearby. Festivals could celebrate the safe passage of herds, honouring both the danger avoided and the opportunities gained. These rituals weren't symbolic alone. They were practical ways of reinforcing cultural memory, teaching each generation the rules of survival. Civilization here was not abstract. It was survival made collective, made enduring through tradition. Even architecture would be different. Where we built open plazas and wide roads, people in this world might carve narrow passageways, hidden courtyards, and reinforced shelters. Roofs would be built low, covered with stone to resist accidental trampling. Watchtowers would rise above cliffs, allowing sentinels to track giants from miles away. Entire settlements might be invisible from the plains below, designed to hide rather than to dominate. Civilization was not about being seen. It was about surviving unseen, small clusters of stone holding out against a world that never stopped moving. The relationship between humans and dinosaurs might occasionally shift into something resembling partnership. Smaller dinosaurs that scavenged near camps could serve as alarms, their cries warning of predators. Some groups might even encourage these relationships, leaving scraps of food to keep the creatures close. Larger herbivores could never be tamed, but their predictable migrations might be used as guides, showing humans when to move, when to plant, when to prepare. Civilization here was not about control, but about rhythm, learning to live in time with the giants, aligning human activity with their movements. Conflicts would still erupt. Predators drawn to settlements could destroy months of preparation in a single night. Herds moving unexpectedly could flatten stone walls, leaving nothing behind. Each disaster became part of the cycle, remembered in stories, rebuilt in determination. Civilizations of stone and scale would endure not because they avoided disaster, but because they rebuilt after it, carrying memory forward, strengthening walls, deepening traditions. Persistence became the true monument, more enduring than any single building or field. Children born into these civilizations would never know a world without giants. Their lullabies would be sung against the backdrop of distant calls, their first steps taken on stone floors carved to resist crushing weight. They would be taught early the importance of silence at night, the vigilance of watchfires, the sacred duty of tending crops hidden from herds. Childhood was short, responsibility arriving quickly, because survival required every hand. Yet even in this harshness there was wonder. Children would stare wide-eyed at herds passing below, their imaginations filled with awe at the living mountains that shared their world. Civilization gave them safety, but the giants gave them stories. Over centuries, civilizations of stone and scale might grow complex. Languages expanded to include precise terms for every type of dinosaur, every call, every danger. Art grew more elaborate, capturing not only humans but the giants that defined their lives. Songs became layered with rhythm, imitating the thunder of footsteps, the echoes of calls across valleys. Identity itself was built on coexistence. To be human was to be small, but to be part of a civilization was to endure together, carving permanence out of stone against the endless motion of scale. Imagine standing on a cliff at dusk, looking down at a valley filled with herds. The firelight of your settlement glows behind you, tucked safely into the rock. The calls of giants echo across the land, and predators lurk somewhere unseen. You know your people will survive the night, because stone surrounds you, because fire burns, because watchmen keep their eyes on the dark. Civilization in this world is not triumph over nature. It is the creation of fragile islands of safety within it. And yet those islands endure generation after generation, proof that even among giants, humans can build something lasting. Civilizations of stone and scale remind us that survival is not only about strength, it is about memory, about cooperation, about the ability to transform fragility into resilience. In our world, extinction cleared the path for us to rise. In theirs, the giants remained, and yet people still found a way to live, to build, to pass knowledge forward. Civilization was never guaranteed. It was carved, carefully, painstakingly, in a world that belonged to others. That endurance, more than any monument, is the true mark of humanity. History is often told as a story of progress, one stage leading into the next, each generation building on what came before. In our world, that story is shaped by extinction events that cleared space for mammals, then for primates, then for humans. But in a world where dinosaurs never left, the story would not follow the same arc. It would be longer, slower, less about domination, and more about persistence. The long view of history in such a world is not a straight path upward, but a winding line, bending always around the presence of giants that never stopped walking the earth. Humans would never look back on their past and see a moment of inheritance, a sudden opening when the land became theirs. They would see continuity instead, a chain of survival tied to the movements of herds and predators. The memory of ancestors would not be about conquering new land, but about enduring in the same spaces, always negotiating, always adapting. History in this world would be measured less by monuments or kings, and more by the long rhythms of migration, by the survival of fire, by the ability to pass down knowledge without losing it to disaster. The long view would not celebrate conquest, it would celebrate endurance. Generations would pass with little visible change. A child born 1,000 years after another might live in a settlement, still carved into cliffs, still guarded by fire, still shadowed by the footsteps of giants. Progress would happen, yes, but it would happen slowly, in small refinements of tools, in new rituals, in sharper stories that better explain danger. The presence of dinosaurs would slow the pace of change, pressing people to spend more energy on survival than on experimentation. History would feel heavy, stretched, defined more by cycles than by leaps. To take the long view in such a world was to accept that progress was measured not in triumphs, but in continuance. Yet continuity is not stagnation. Over centuries, those small refinements accumulate. The sharpening of stone becomes the shaping of metal, perhaps in places where fire burns hot enough to reveal it. The building of shelters becomes the carving of complex fortresses into cliffs. Language grows richer, art grows bolder, stories grow deeper. Even without sudden leaps, the long view shows change. But it is change woven tightly with the presence of giants, never breaking free from them, always reflecting their shadow. Civilization grows, but it grows in the cracks, in the places where giants allow it. History here is not human-centered, it is shared. The very way people understood time would be different. In our world, time is often measured by human achievement, eras of kings, ages of empires, centuries of invention. In a world with dinosaurs, time would be measured by herds and predators. Stories might mark the year of the Great Migration, the decade when a particular valley was safe, the century when herds shifted their path. Time was not linear progress, but cycles, repeating rhythms of creatures whose lives stretched far longer than human memory. The long view of history was not about what people achieved, it was about how they endured within cycles larger than themselves. This perspective would shape culture profoundly. Myths and legends would not emphasize human dominance but humility, placing people as small participants in an older, larger story. Religion might describe history not as a march toward salvation, but as an endless negotiation with giants and predators, each generation repeating the lessons of the last. Even art might reflect this, showing not the rise of humans but the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs, side by side across endless time. The long view did not glorify humans alone, it reminded them of their place. Children would grow up hearing stories that stretched across centuries. They would learn not of single heroes, but of entire lineages, groups that survived the same dangers generation after generation. They would hear of valleys that had been safe for hundreds of years, only to be abandoned when herds shifted. They would see themselves not as individuals building something new, but as links in a chain, carrying forward what their ancestors preserved. History was not personal achievement, it was continuity, and every child carried responsibility for extending it. Conflicts between groups would still occur, but they would be tempered by the shared reality of giants. Wars could not rage unchecked, because both sides knew that predators and herds paid no attention to human quarrels. A battle could be swept aside in a single night by a passing predator, turning victory into meaningless loss. Over time, this might shape diplomacy differently, creating a culture where negotiation mattered more than destruction, where survival against giants was seen as the greater concern. The long view of history did not leave room for endless human rivalry. It forced cooperation, even in conflict. The memory of extinction, or the lack of it, would also change perspective. In our world, the fall of dinosaurs makes human dominance feel inevitable. In theirs, the giants endured, and humans never forgot it. The long view would always include awareness that people were not alone, not destined to rule, not immune to disappearance. Every story of survival carried the shadow of possible loss. This humility might make human history less arrogant, less prone to imagining itself as the centre of everything. In a world of dinosaurs, the long view of history was not about humans at all. It was about life itself, enduring in countless forms, of which humans were only one. Imagine a gathering of elders in such a world. They sit by the fire, telling children of the migrations their parents endured, The predators they faced, the herds they followed. Their stories stretch back farther than any one memory, woven from generations of retelling. The children listen not to tales of conquest, but to reminders of fragility and endurance. They learn that history is not a ladder climbing upward, but a circle turning endlessly, always bringing the same lessons back again. This is the long view, history as rhythm, not as rise. Over centuries, this perspective could produce civilizations that valued patience above all. They might not build empires or wage great wars. They might instead focus on preserving knowledge, on maintaining traditions, on ensuring that fire never dies, that crops are always planted, that children always learn the stories. Their monuments might not be towering structures but careful carvings in stone, designed to last through countless migrations. Their art might not celebrate victory but continuity, showing fire carried from one valley to the next, one generation to another. Civilization itself would reflect the long view, emphasizing endurance over change. Yet even in this slower history, humans would adapt, innovate, and find new ways forward. The difference was scale. In our world, we measure progress in centuries. In theirs, progress would be measured in millennia, slow arcs that only reveal themselves when viewed across vast spans of time. To live within that history meant accepting that change was never immediate, that progress was never certain, that survival was the first and greatest achievement. The long view of history teaches humility. It reminds people that they are not the sole actors, not the inevitable rulers, not even the central figures of their own world. In a land still filled with dinosaurs, humans remain participants in a larger drama, small but persistent, fragile but enduring. Their history is not about replacing giants, but about surviving alongside them, and that perhaps is the truest definition of strength. Every story we have told so far rests on a question that will never be answered by experience. What if humans had lived alongside dinosaurs? The thought carries weight because it didn't happen. Our ancestors never saw sauropods stretch their necks above forests, never heard the roar of predators echo across valleys, never lit fires in the shadows of creatures larger than any mammal alive today. Instead, the asteroid struck, ecosystems collapsed, and the stage was cleared for mammals to grow, change, and eventually produce us. The world of people and dinosaurs together is a world that never was, yet imagining it reveals truths about the one that is. In considering that impossible world, we see how fragile our history has always been. A different tilt of fate, a slightly different timing, and the giants might have remained. If that had been the case, our story would be one of survival in the margins, never of dominance. The idea that humans inherited the Earth only feels natural because the dinosaurs left. Without their absence, we would have been forever small, forever shadowed, forever cautious. The world that never was forces us to see that our sense of inevitability, our belief that humans were always destined to rise, is an illusion. It depended on chance, on catastrophe, on a history that might easily have unfolded differently. This imagined world also reminds us of the role fear plays in shaping existence. Humans are fragile, and in a land of giants, that fragility would be constant. Every step outside a camp, every sound in the night, every shadow at dusk would remind people of their smallness. Their stories, tools, and rituals would all reflect that weight, and yet they would endure. The fire would be carried, the migrations would continue, the myths would be told. The world that never was reveals how much of human identity comes not from power, but from persistence, from the refusal to give up even when surrounded by overwhelming threat. At the same time, imagining this world shows us what we lost when dinosaurs disappeared. No human ever stood beneath the full shadow of a sauropod. No child ever reached toward the sky as pterosaurs glided above. No hunter ever crouched in grass while raptors circled close. Those experiences are gone, locked forever in the past. Our world is rich in life, but it lacks the scale, the immensity, the sheer strangeness that would have defined a world still ruled by dinosaurs. The world that never was is also the world we can never see, one of endless awe mixed with endless danger. But perhaps the most important lesson comes from realizing how humans might have changed in such a world. Without dominance, we would have grown differently. Humility might have been at the center of our cultures. Cooperation might have carried more weight than competition. Our relationship with nature might have been one of negotiation rather than conquest. Civilization itself might have developed slowly, hidden in cliffs and caves, carried not by rulers and empires but by stories and traditions that stretched across generations. We would still be human, but human in a different sense, shaped less by the urge to control and more by the need to endure. The world that never was also highlights how narrow our view of time can be. Dinosaurs ruled for millions of years, far longer than humans have yet existed. Their disappearance created the space for us, but their endurance reminds us of how short our story still is. We imagine ourselves at the centre, but we are only at the beginning. The world that never was invites us to step back, to see history not as a ladder we climb, but as a vast field of possibilities, most of them unrealised. We are one thread among countless others, and chance has always guided which ones survive. Imagine, for a moment, a child in that alternate world. They sit by a fire at night, listening to the deep calls of herds echoing across the plains. Their parent tells them a story of giants, of guardians and threats, of survival and awe. The child listens, wide-eyed, feeling both fear and wonder at the world beyond the firelight. That child will grow, carry the fire forward, and teach their own children the same lessons. The cycle will continue, generation after generation, never producing empires as we know them, never building cities that scrape the sky, but preserving something equally important: continuity, memory, resilience. The world that never was would still be filled with meaning, even if it was not filled with conquest. The question, then, is why we imagine it at all. Perhaps because the idea of people among dinosaurs captures both our deepest fears and our greatest fascinations. It is a reminder of smallness, of fragility, of the thin line between survival and destruction. But it is also a reminder of wonder, of the beauty of life in forms beyond our comprehension. To imagine humans among dinosaurs is to imagine ourselves in a story larger than we have ever lived, one that humbles us but also inspires us. The world that never was is not only fantasy, it is a mirror, reflecting truths about our real world, truths we often forget. And so we return to the fire, to the imagined circle of a light surrounded by shadows. Beyond it, the giants move unseen, their footsteps shaking the ground, their calls echoing through the night. Inside it, people sit close, telling stories, watching the flames, teaching children how to endure. That image is both impossible and real. It never happened, but it tells us something about who we are. Fragile, cautious, persistent, always seeking meaning in the face of vastness. The world that never was may remain forever out of reach, but in imagining it, we learn something vital about the world that is.